Hey everybody, this is a selection from The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Volume 2, The Two Trotskyisms Confront Stalinism. The piece is titled Unconditional Defense of the USSR. It's by James P. Cannon. As you know, James P. Cannon represented the majority position in the Socialist Workers' Party, and his faction won in the dispute of 1939-40, which led to the expulsion of the minority from the Socialist Workers' Party, which would then go on to form the Workers' Party and the continuation of the Socialist Workers' Party under the leadership of James P. Cannon, while the Workers' Party was under the leadership of Max Shachtman. The piece is from Part 2 of the book and Section 2 of the book. Part 2 is titled The Great Schism. Section 2 is titled Defend Russia in the Hitler-Stalin Defend Russia in Hitler-Stalin Poland? Question mark. And the little introduction to the section says, the first two texts are the speeches delivered by James P. Cannon and Max Shachtman at the New York membership meeting of the U.S. Trotskyist movement, the Socialist Workers' Party, on the 15th of October 1939. Cannon and Shachtman, the two main leaders of the movement since it was founded in 1928, spoke for opposing sides in this debate, sparked by the invasion and partition of Poland by Stalin and Hitler in September 1939. Contrary to most tellings of the story, the debate was not about how to label the USSR. Shachtman and most of his comrades still accepted the, quote, degenerated worker state, end quote, formula, though with doubts, and they accepted, quote, defense of the USSR, end quote, against invasion by a big power. It was essentially about the balance between condemnation of Stalin's invasion and hypothetical defense of the USSR against big power invasion. And like I said, I'm just reading for this video, I'm just reading the James P. Cannon piece. So, here we go. This is from 1939. The Russian question is with us once again, as the Russian question has been with us at every critical turning of the international labor movement since November 7, 1917, and there is nothing strange in that. The Russian question is no literary exercise to be taken up or cast aside according to the mood of the movement, the mood of the moment. The Russian question has been and remains The Russian question has been and remains the question of the revolution. The Russian Bolsheviks of November 7, 1917, once and for all took the question of the workers' revolution out of the realm of abstraction and gave the question of the workers' revolution flesh and blood reality. It was once said of a book, I think it was Whitman's Leaves of Grass, quote, who touches this book touches a man, end quote. In the same sense, it can also be said, quote, who touches the Russian question touches a revolution, end quote. Therefore, be serious about the Russian question. Don't play with the Russian question. The October Revolution put socialism on the order of the day throughout the world. The October Revolution revived and shaped and developed the revolutionary labor movement of the world out of the bloody chaos of the war. The Russian Revolution showed in practice by example how the workers' revolution is to be made. The Russian Revolution revealed in life the role of the party. The Russian Revolution showed in life what kind of party the workers must have. By the Russian Revolution's victory, by the Russian Revolution's reorganization of the social system, the Russian Revolution has proved for all time the superiority of nationalized property and planned economy over capitalist private property and planless competition and anarchy in production. The question of the Russian Revolution and the Soviet state which is the Russian Revolution's creation, has drawn a sharp dividing line through the labor movement of all countries for 22 years. The attitude taken toward the Soviet Union throughout all these years has been the decisive criterion, separating the genuine revolutionary tendency from all shades and degrees of waverers, backsliders, capitulators to the pressure of the bourgeois world. end capitulators to the pressure of the bourgeois world. The Mensheviks, Social Democrats, anarchists, and syndicalists, centrists, and Stalinists. The main source of division in our own ranks for the past 10 years since the Fourth Internationalist tendency took organized form on the international field has been the Russian question. Our tendency, being a genuine, that is, orthodox Marxist tendency from A to Z, has always proceeded on the Russian question from theoretical premises to political conclusions for action. Of course, it is only when political conclusions are drawn out to the end that differences on the Russian question reach an unbearable acuteness and permit no ambiguity or compromise. Conclusions on the Russian question lead directly to positions on such issues as war and revolution, defense and defeatism. Such issues by their very nature admit no unclarity, no compromise, because it is a matter of taking sides. One must be on one side or another in war and revolution. But if the lines are drawn only when political conclusions diverge, that does not at all signify that we are indifferent to theoretical premises. He is a very poor Marxist, better say no Marxist at all, who takes a careless or tolerant attitude toward theoretical premises. The political conclusions of Marxists proceed from theoretical analyses and are constantly checked and regulated by them. That is the only way to assure a firm and consistent policy. To be sure, we do not decline cooperation with people who agree with our political conclusions from different premises. For example, the Bolsheviks were not deterred by the fact that the left SRs were inconsistent. As Trotsky remarked in this connection, quote, "If we wait till everything is right in everybody's head, there will never be any successful revolution in this world," end quote, or words to that effect. Just the same, for our part, we want everything right in our own heads. We have no reason whatever to slur over theoretical formulae which are expressed in, quote, terminology. As Trotsky says in theoretical matters, quote, "We must keep our house clean," end quote. Our position on the Russian question is programmatic. In brief, the theoretical analysis, a degenerated worker state. The political conclusion, unconditional defense against external attack of imperialist or internal attempts at capitalist restoration. Defensism and defeatism are two principled, that is, irreconcilable positions. Defensism and defeatism are not determined by arbitrary choice but by class interests. No party in the world ever succeeded in harboring these two antipathic tendencies for any great length of time. The contradiction is too great. Division all over the world ultimately took place along this line. Defensists at home were defeatists on Russia. Defensists on Russia were defeatists at home. The degeneration of the Soviet state under Stalin has been analyzed at every step by the Bolshevik-Leninists and only by the Bolshevik-Leninists. If you don't know, that's what the Trotskyists often refer to themselves as, at least in this period. A precise attitude has been taken at every stage. The guiding lines of the revolutionary Marxist approach to the question have been, quote, I don't know if that's a quote, have been, forget the quote part. The guiding lines of the revolutionary Marxist approach to the question have been, see the reality and see the reality whole at every stage, never surrender any position before that position is lost. The worst of all capitulators is the one who capitulates before the decisive battle. The international left opposition which originated in 1923 as an opposition in the Russian Party, the original nuclei of the Fourth International, has always taken a precise attitude on the Russian question. In the first stages of the degeneration of which the Stalinist bureaucracy was the banner bearer, the opposition considered it possible to rectify matters by methods of reform through the change of regime in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Later, when it became clear that the Communist Party of Lenin had been irredeemably destroyed, and after it became manifest that the reactionary bureaucracy could be removed only by civil war, the Fourth International, standing as before on its analysis of the Soviet Union as a worker state, came out for a political revolution. All the time throughout this entire period of 16 years, the Bolshevik-Leninists have stoutly maintained in the face of all slander and persecution that they were the firmest defenders of the workers' state and that in the hour of danger they would be in the front ranks of its defense. We always said that the moment of danger will find the Fourth Internationalists at their post defending the conquest of the Great Revolution. Without ceasing for a moment our struggle against the Stalinist bureaucracy. Now that the hour of danger is at hand, now that the long-awaited war is actually knocking at the door, it would be very strange that the Fourth International should renege on its oft-repeated pledge. Throughout all this long period of Soviet degeneration since the death of Lenin, the Fourth International is analyzing the new phenomenon of a degenerating worker state at every turn, striving to comprehend its complications and contradictions, to recognize and defend all the progressive features of the contradictory processes, and to reject the reactionary. During all this time, we have been beset at every new turn of events by the impatient demands of, quote, radicals to simplify the question. Thrown off balance by the crimes and betrayals of Stalin, they lost sight of the new system of economy which Stalin had not destroyed and could not destroy. This is just a side note, but not only destroyed, but expanded drastically. Anyway, we always firmly rejected these premature announcements that everything was lost and that we must begin all over again. At each stage of development, at each new revelation of Stalinist infamy and treachery, some group or other broke away from the Fourth International because of its, quote, conservatism, end quote, on the Russian question. It would be interesting if we had the time to call the roll of these groupings, which one after another left our ranks to pursue an ostensibly more, quote, revolutionary, end quote, policy on the Russian question. Did they develop an activity more militant, more revolutionary than ours? Did they succeed in creating a new movement and in attracting newly awakened workers and those breaking from Stalinism? In no case. If we were to call the roll of these ultra-radical groups, it would present a devastating picture indeed. Those who did not fall into complete political passivity became reconciled in one form or another to bourgeois democracy. The experiences of the past should teach us all a salutary caution, and even, if you please, quote, conservatism, end quote, in approaching any proposal to revise the program of the Fourth International on the Russian question. While all the innovators fell by the wayside, the Fourth International alone retained its programmatic firmness. It grew and developed and remained the only genuine revolutionary current in the labor movement of the world. Without a firm position on the Russian question, our movement also would inevitably have shared the fate of the others. The mighty power of the October Revolution is shown by the vitality of its conquests. The nationalized property and the planned economy stood up under all the difficulties and pressures of the capitalist encirclement and all the blows of a reactionary bureaucracy at home. In the Soviet Union, despite the monstrous mismanagement of the bureaucracy, we saw a tremendous development of the productive forces, and in a backward country at that, while capitalist economy declined. Conclusion: nationalized and planned economy made possible by a revolution that overthrew the capitalists and landlords is infinitely superior and more progressive. It shows the way forward. Don't give it up before it is lost. Cling to it and defend it. On the Russian question, there are only two really independent forces in the world. Two forces who think about the question independently because they base themselves, their thoughts, their analysis, and their conclusions on fundamental class considerations. These two independent forces are: one, the conscious vanguard of the world bourgeoisie, the statesmen of both democratic and fascist imperialism. Two, the conscious vanguard of the world proletariat. Between them is not simply a case of two opinions on the Russian question, but rather of two camps. All those who in the past rejected the conclusions of the Fourth International and broke with our movement on that account have almost invariably fallen into the service of the imperialists through Stalinism, social and liberal democracy, or passivity, a form of service. The standpoint of the world bourgeoisie is a class standpoint. They proceed as we do from fundamental class considerations. They want to maintain world capitalism. This determines their fundamental antagonism to the USSR. They appreciate the reactionary work of Stalin, but consider it incomplete insofar as he has not restored capitalist private property. Their fundamental attitude determines an inevitable attempt at the start of the war, or during it, to attack Russia, overthrow the nationalized economy, restore a capitalist regime, smash the foreign trade monopoly, open up the Soviet Union as a market and field of investments, transform Russia into a great colony, and thereby alleviate the crisis of world capitalism. The standpoint of the Fourth International is based on the same fundamental class considerations. We only draw opposite conclusions from an opposite class standpoint. Purely sentimental motivations, speculation about fundamental class premises, so-called, quote, fresh ideas, end quote, with no programmatic base. All this is out of place in a party of Marxists. We want to advance the world revolution of the proletariat. This determines our attitude and approach to the Russian question. True, we want to see reality, but we are not disinterested observers and commentators. We do not examine the Russian Revolution and what remains of its great conquest as though it were a bug under a glass. We have an interest. We take part in the fight. At each stage in the development of the Soviet Union, its advances and its degeneration, we seek the basis for revolutionary action. We want to advance the world revolution, overthrow capitalism, establish socialism. The Soviet Union is an important and decisive question on this line. Our standpoint on the Russian question is written into our program. It is not a new question for us. It is 22 years old. We have followed its evolution, both progressive and retrogressive, at every stage. We have discussed it and taken our position anew at every stage of its progressive development and its degeneration. And what is most important, we have always acted on our conclusions. The Soviet Union emerged from the October Revolution as a workers' state. As a result of the backwardness and poverty of the country and the delay of the world revolution, a conservative bureaucracy emerged and triumphed, destroyed the party, and bureaucratized the economy. However, this same bureaucracy still operates on the basis of the nationalized property established by the revolution. That is the decisive question of our evaluation of the question. If we see the Soviet Union for what it really is, a gigantic labor organization which has conquered 1/6 of the Earth's surface, we will not be so ready to abandon the Soviet Union because of pure hatred of the crimes and abominations of the bureaucracy. Do we turn our backs on a trade union because that trade union falls into the control of bureaucrats and traders? That's a frequent analogy that's used by the defenders of the degenerated worker state thesis, as well as the unconditional people who put forward unconditional defense of the USSR. The comparison between the corrupt bureaucracy in the USSR and the corrupt bureaucracy in a trade union. Ultra-leftists have frequently made this error, but always with bad results, sometimes with reactionary consequences. We recall the case of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union here in New York. The bureaucrats of this union were about as vile a gang of labor lieutenants of the capitalist class as can be found. In the struggle against the left wing in the middle 20s, they conspired with the bosses and the AFL fakers. They expelled the left-wing locals and used hired thugs to fight them and to break their strikes. The difference between them and Stalin was only a matter of opportunity and power. Driven to revolt against the crimes of these bureaucrats, the left wing, under the influence of the Communist Party, in the days of its third period frenzy, labeled the Union, not merely its treacherous bureaucracy, as a, quote, company union, end quote, but this same, quote, company union, under the pressure of the workers in that company union's ranks and the increasing intensity of the class struggle, was forced to call a strike to defend itself against the, quote, imperialist attack of the bosses. Workers who had kept their heads supported, quote, defended the strike against the bosses, but the Stalinists, tracked by their own hastily improvised theory, having already denounced the union as a company union, renounced support, quote, defense of the strike. They denounced it as, a, quote, fake strike. Thus, their ill-considered radicalism led them to a reactionary position. They were denounced, and rightly, throughout the needle trades market as strike breakers. To this day, they suffer the discredit of this reactionary action. To defend the Soviet Union as a gigantic labor organization against the attacks of the Soviet Union's class enemies does not mean to defend each and every action of the Soviet Union's bureaucracy, or each and every action of the Red Army, which is an instrument of the bureaucracy. To impute such a, quote, totalitarian, end quote, concept of defense to the Fourth International is absurd. Nobody here will deny defense of a bona fide trade union, no matter how reactionary that trade union's bureaucracy. But that does not prevent us from discriminating between actions of the bureaucracy, which involve a defense of the union against the bosses, and other actions which are aimed against the workers. The United Mine Workers of America is a great labor organization which we all support. But The United Mine Workers of America is headed by a thoroughgoing scoundrel and agent of the master class who also differs from Stalin only in the degree of power and opportunity. In my own personal experience some years ago, I took part in a strike of the Kansas miners which was directed against the enforcement of a reactionary labor law known as the Kansas Industrial Court Law, a law forbidding strikes. This is a thoroughly progressive action on the part of the Kansas miners and their president, Alex Howitt. Wikipedia says Alexander Howitt lived from 1876 to 1945 and was a Scottish-born American coal miner and trade union leader. Alexander Howitt is best remembered as the chief opponent of the Kansas Court of Industrial Relations in the early 1920s and as the leader of a radical rank-and-file revolt against the officialdom of the United Mine Workers of America, UMWA, in 1923. Alexander Howitt's activity ultimately led to his expulsion from the United Mine Workers of America in 1930, forcing Alexander Howitt into new occupations outside the organized labor movement. So, that's who Alexander Howitt is. Howitt and the other local officials were thrown into jail. While they were in jail, John L. Lewis, as president of the national organization, sent his agents into the Kansas fields to sign an agreement with the bosses over the head of the officers of the Kansas district. John L. Lewis supplied strikebreakers and thugs and money to break the strike while the legitimate officers of the union lay in jail for a good cause. Every militant worker in the country denounced this treacherous strike-breaking action of John L. Lewis. But did we therefore renounce support of the National Union of Mine Workers? Yes, some impatient revolutionaries did and thereby completely disoriented themselves in the labor movement. The United Mine Workers retained its character as a labor organization and only last spring came into conflict with the coal operators on a national scale. I think you all recall that in this contest, our press gave, quote, unconditional defense, end quote, to the miners' union despite the fact that strikebreaker Lewis remained its president. The Longshoremen's Union of the Pacific Coast is a bona fide organization of workers headed by a Stalinist of an especially unattractive type, a pocket edition of Stalin named Bridges. Is that Harry Bridges? God, I'm smart. Wikipedia says Harry Bridges, who lived from 1901 to 1990, was an Australian-born American Union leader, first with the International Longshoremen's Association. In 1937, Harry Bridges led several chapters in forming a new union, the International Longshoremen and Warehouse Union, expanded members to workers in warehouses and led it for the next 40 years. Harry Bridges was prosecuted for his labor organizing and designated as subversive by the U.S. government during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s with the goal of deportation. This was never achieved. Harry Bridges became a naturalized citizen in 1945. His conviction by a federal jury for having lied about his Communist Party membership when seeking naturalization was overturned by the Supreme Court in 1953 as having been prosecuted untimely outside the statute of limitations. Harry Bridges' official power was reduced when the International Longshore and Warehouse Union was expelled by the CIO in 1950, but Harry Bridges continued to be re-elected by the membership and was highly influential until his retirement in 1977. So that's Harry Bridges. Back to the text. This same Harry Bridges led a squad of misguided longshoremen through a picket line of the Sailors Union in a direct attempt to break up this organization. I think all of you recall that our press scathingly denounced this contemptible action of Harry Bridges. But if the Longshoremen's Union, headed by Harry Bridges, which is at this moment conducting negotiations with the bosses, is compelled to resort to strike action, what stand shall we take? Any ordinary class-conscious worker, let alone an educated Marxist, will be on the picket line with the Longshoremen's Union of, quote, defending it by some other means. Why is it so difficult for some of our friends, including some of those who are very well educated in the formal sense, to understand the Russian question? I am very much afraid it is because they do not think of it in terms of struggle. It is strikingly evident that the workers, especially the more experienced workers who have taken part in trade union strikes, etc., understand the Russian question much better than the more educated scholastics. From their experiences in the struggle, they know that what it meant when the Soviet Union is compared to a trade union that has fallen into bad hands, and everyone who has been through a couple of strikes which underwent crises and came to the brink of disaster, finally to emerge victorious, understands what is meant when one says no position must be surrendered until it is irrevocably lost. I personally have seen the fate of more than one strike determined by the will or lack of will of the leadership to struggle at a critical moment. All our trade union successes in Minneapolis stem back directly to a fateful week in 1934 when the leaders refused to call off the strike, which to all appearances was hopelessly defeated, and persuaded the strike committee to hold out a while longer. In that intervening time, a break occurred in the ranks of the bosses. This in turn paved the way for a compromise settlement and eventually a victorious advance for the whole union. How strange it is that some people analyze the weakness and defects in the workers' organization so closely that they do not always take into account the weakness in the camp of the enemy, which may easily more than counterbalance. In my own agitation among strikers at dark moments of a strike, I have frequently resorted to the analogy of two men engaged in a physical fight. When one gets tired and apparently at the end of his resources, he should never forget that the other fellow is maybe just as tired, even more so. In that case, the one who holds out will prevail. Looked at in this way, a worn-out strike can sometimes be carried through to a compromise or a victory by the resolute will of its leadership. We have seen this happen more than once. Why should we deny the Soviet Union, which has not yet exhausted the same rights? We have had many discussions on the Russian question in the past. It has been the central and decisive question for us, as for every political tendency in the labor movement. That, I repeat, is because it is nothing less than the question of the revolution at various stages of its progressive development or degeneration. We are, in fact, the party of the Russian Revolution. We have been the people, and the only people, who have had the Russian Revolution in their program and in their blood. That is also the main reason why the Fourth International is the only revolutionary tendency in the whole world. A false position on the Russian question would have destroyed our movement as a false position on the Russian question destroyed all others. 2 years ago, we once again conducted an extensive discussion on the Russian question. The almost unanimous conclusion of the party was written into the program of our first convention. 1. The Soviet Union, on the basis of its nationalized property and planned economy, the fruit of the revolution, remains a worker state, though in a degenerated form. 2. As such, we stand as before for the unconditional defense of the Soviet Union against imperialist attack. 3. The best defense, the only thing that can save the Soviet Union in the end by solving its contradictions, is the international revolution of the proletariat. 4. In order to regenerate the worker state, we stand for the overthrow of the bureaucracy by a political revolution. But it may be said, quote, defense of the Soviet Union and Russia as a workers' state, those two phrases don't answer anything, end quote. They are not simply phrases. One is a theoretical analysis, the other is a political conclusion for action. Our motion calls for unconditional defense of the Soviet Union against imperialist attack. What does that mean? It simply means that we defend the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union's nationalized property against external attacks of imperialist armies or against internal attempts at capitalist restoration, without putting as a prior condition the overthrow of the Stalinist bureaucracy. Any other kind of defense negates the whole position under present circumstances. Some people speak nowadays of giving, quote, conditional defense to the Soviet Union. If you stop to think about it, we are for conditional defense of the United States. It is so stated in the program of the Fourth International. In the event of war, we will absolutely defend the country on only one small, quote, condition, that we first overthrow the government of the capitalists and replace it with a government of the workers. Does unconditional defense of the Soviet Union mean supporting every act of the Red Army? No. That is absurd. Did we support the Moscow trials and the actions of Stalin's GPU in those trials? Did we support the purges, the wholesale murder of the old Bolsheviks? Did we support the actions of the Stalinist military forces in Spain, which were directed against the workers? If I recall correctly, we unconditionally defended those workers who fought on the other side of the barricades in Barcelona. That did not prevent us from supporting the military struggle against Franco and maintaining our position in defense of the Soviet Union against imperialist attack. It is now demanded that we take a big step forward and support the idea of an armed struggle against Stalin in the newly occupied territories of Old Poland. Is this really something new? For 3 years, the Fourth International has advocated in its program the armed overthrow of Stalin inside the Soviet Union itself. The Fourth International has generally acknowledged the necessity for an armed struggle to set up an independent Soviet Ukraine. How can there be any question of having a different policy in the newly occupied territories? If the revolution against Stalin is really ready there, the Fourth International will certainly support it and endeavor to lead it. There are no two opinions possible in our ranks on this question. But what shall we do if Hitler or Chamberlain attacks the Sovietized Ukraine before Stalin has been overthrown? This is the question that needs an unambiguous answer. Shall we defend the Soviet Union and with it now and for the same reasons, the nationalized property of the newly annexed territories? We say yes. That position was incorporated into the program of the Foundation Congress of the Fourth International, held in the summer of 1938. Remember that was after the Moscow trials and the crushing of the Spanish Revolution. It was after the murderous purge of the whole generation of Bolsheviks, after the People's Front, the entry into the League of Nations, the Stalin-Laval Pact, and betrayal of the French workers. We took our position on the basis of the economic structure of the country, the fruit of the revolution. The great gains are not to be surrendered before they are really lost. That is the fighting program of the Fourth International. The Stalin-Hitler Pact does not change anything fundamentally. If Stalin were allied with the United States and comrades should deny defense of the Soviet Union out of fear of becoming involved in the defense of Stalin's American ally, such comrades would be wrong, but their position would be understandable as a subjective reaction prompted by revolutionary sentiments. The, quote, defeatism, which broke out in our French sections following the Stalin-Laval Pact was undoubtedly so motivated and consequently had to be refuted with the utmost tolerance and patience, but an epidemic of, quote, defeatism in the democratic camp would be simply shameful. There is no pressure on us in America to defend the Soviet Union. All the pressure is for a democratic holy war against the Soviet Union. Let us keep this in mind. The enemy remains still in our own country. What has happened since our last discussion? Has there been some fundamental change in Soviet economy? No, nothing of that kind is maintained. Nothing happened except that Stalin signed the pact with Hitler. For us, that gave no reason whatever to change our analysis of Soviet economy and our attitude toward it. The aim of all our previous theoretical work, concentrated in our program, was precisely to prepare us for war and revolution. Now we have the war, and revolution is next in order. If we have to stop now to find a new program, it is a very bad sign. Just consider, there are people who could witness all the crimes and betrayals of Stalin, which we understood better than anybody else, and denounce before anybody else, and more effectively. They could witness all this and still stand for the defense of the Soviet Union, but they could not tolerate the alliance with fascist Germany instead of imperialist England or France. Of course, there's been a great hullabaloo about the Soviet invasion of Polish Ukraine, but that is simply one of the consequences of the war and the alliance with Hitler's Germany. The contention that we should change our analysis of the social character of the Soviet state and our attitude toward its defense because the Red Army violated the Polish border is even more absurd than to base such changes on the Hitler Pact. The Polish invasion is only an incident in a war, and in wars, borders are always violated. If all the armies stayed at home, there could be no war. The inviolability of borders, all of which were established by war, is interesting to democratic pacifists and to nobody else. Hear all the democratic clamor, we had to ask ourselves, hearing all the democratic clamor, we had to ask ourselves many times, don't they know that Western Ukraine and White Russia never rightfully belonged to Poland? Don't they know that this territory was forcibly taken from the Soviet Union by Pilsudski, quasi-fascist Polish head of state, with French aid in 1920? To be sure, this did not justify Stalin's invasion of the territory in collaboration with Hitler. We never supported that, and we never supported the fraudulent claim that Stalin was bringing, quote, liberation to the peoples of the Polish Ukraine. At the same time, we did not propose to yield an inch to the, quote, democratic incitement against the Soviet Union on the basis of the Polish events. The democratic warmongers were shrieking at the top of their voices all over town. We must not be duly impressed by this democratic clamor. Our National Committee was not in the least impressed. In order to penetrate a little deeper into this question and trace it to its roots, let us take another hypothetical example. Not a fantastic example, but a very logical example. Suppose Stalin had made a pact with the imperialist democracies against Hitler, while Romania had allied itself with Hitler. Suppose, as would most probably have happened in that case, the Red Army had struck at Romania, Hitler's ally instead of Poland, the ally of the democracies, and had seized Bessarabia, bracket Eastern Romania, and bracket, which also belonged to Russia, which once also belonged to Russia. Would the democratic warmongers in that case have howled, quote, red imperialism, end quote? Not on your life. I am very glad that our National Committee maintained its independence from bourgeois democratic pressure on the Polish invasion. The question was put to us very excitedly, point blank like a pistol at the temple. Quote, are you for or against the invasion of Poland, end quote? But revolutionary Marxists don't answer in a, quote, yes or, quote, no manner, which can lump them together with people who pursue opposite aims. Being for or against something is not enough in the class struggle. It is necessary to explain from what standpoint one is for or against. Are you for or against racketeering gangsters and trade unions? The Philistines sometimes ask. We don't jump to attention like a private soldier who had met an officer on the street and answer, quote, against. We first inquire, who asked this question and from what standpoint, and what weight does this question have in relation to other questions? We have our own standpoint, and we are careful not to get our answers mixed up with those of class enemies and pacifist muddleheads. Some people, especially affected bosses, are against racketeering gangsters in the trade unions because they extort graft from the bosses. That side of the question doesn't interest us very much. Some people, especially pacifist preachers, are against the gangsters because they commit violence. But we are not against violence at all times and under all circumstances. We, for our part, taking our time and formulating our viewpoint, precisely say we are against union gangsterism because union gangsterism injures the union in the union's fight against the bosses. That is our reason. It proceeds from our special class standpoint on the union question. So with Poland, we don't support the course of Stalin in general. Stalin's crime is not one incident here or there, but his whole policy. Stalin demoralizes the workers' movement and discredits the Soviet Union. That is what we are against. Stalin betrays the revolution by his whole course. Every incident for us fits into that framework. It is considered from that point of view and taken in its true proportions. Those who take the Polish invasion, an incident in a great chain of events, as the basis for a fundamental change in our program show a lack of proportion. That is the kindest thing that can be said for them. They are destined to remain in a permanent lather throughout the war. They are already 4 laps behind schedule. There was also Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, and now Finland. We can expect another clamor of demands that we say point blank and in one word whether we are, quote, for or, quote, against the pressure on poor little bourgeois democratic Finland. Our answer, wait a minute. Keep your shirt on. There is no lack of protest on behalf of the bourgeois swine who rule Finland. The new leader has protested. Charles Yale Harrison has written a tearful column about it. Wikipedia says Charles Yale Harrison lived from 1898 to 1954 and was a Canadian-American writer and journalist, best known for his 1930 anti-war novella, Generals Die in Bed. The new leader has protested. Charles Yale Harrison, parenthesis, Charlie the Rat, end parenthesis, has written a tearful column about it. The renegade lore has wept about it in the New York Post. I'm not sure, but it looks like this lore is referring to Ludwig Lohr, who lived from 1875 to 1942, was an American socialist magazine editor, newspaper writer, lecturer, and politician, best remembered for Ludwig Lohr's tenure as editor of the socialist New Yorker Volkszeitung and role as a factional leader in the early American Communist movement. During the mid-1930s, Ludwig Lohr wrote the daily foreign affairs column Behind the Cables for the New York Post. Later still, Ludwig Lohr was charged with having secretly worked recruiting potential agents and gathering information on behalf of the Soviet Foreign Intelligence Network. So that's Lohr. The renegade Lohr has wept about it in the New York Post. The President of the United States has protested. Finland is pretty well covered with moral support. So bourgeois Finland can wait a minute till we explain our attitude without bothering about the, quote, for or against, quote, against ultimatum. I personally feel very deeply about Finland, and this is by no means confined to the present dispute between Stalin and the Finnish Prime Minister. When I think of Finland, I think of the thousands of martyred dead, the proletarian heroes who perished under the White Terror of Mannerheim, bracket, military leader of whites in Finland's Civil War, 1918, I would, if I could, call them back from their graves. Failing that, I will organize a proletarian army of Finnish workers to avenge them and drive their murderers into the Baltic Sea. I would send the Red Army of the regenerated Soviet Union to help them at the decisive moment. We don't support Stalin's invasion only because Stalin doesn't come for revolutionary purposes. Stalin doesn't come off the call of Finnish workers whose confidence he has forfeited. That is the only reason why we are against it. The, quote, borders, end quote, have nothing to do with it. Quote, defense in war also means attack. Do you think we will respect frontiers when we make our revolution? If an enemy army lands troops at Quebec, for example, do you think we will wait placidly at the Canadian border for their attack? No, if we are genuine revolutionists and not pacifist muddleheads, we will cross the border and meet them at the point of landing. And if our defense requires the seizure of Quebec, we will seize it as the Red Army of Lenin seized Georgia and tried to take Warsaw. Some may think the war and the alliance with Hitler change everything we have previously considered, that it, at least, requires a consideration of the whole question of the Soviet Union, if not a complete change in our program. This we can answer. War was contemplated by our program. The fundamental theses on war in the Fourth International, adopted in 1934, say, quote, every big war, irrespective of its initial moves, must pose squarely the question of military intervention against the USSR in order to transfuse fresh blood into the sclerotic veins of capitalism. ... Quote, the defense of the Soviet Union from the blows of the capitalist enemies, irrespective of the circumstances and immediate causes of the conflict, is the elementary and imperative duty of honest labor organization, end quote. Alliances were contemplated. The theses say, quote, in the existing situation, an alliance of the USSR with an imperialist state or with one imperialist state combined against another in case of war cannot at all be considered as excluded. Under the pressure of circumstances, a temporary alliance of this kind may become an iron necessity, without ceasing, however, because of it to be the greatest danger both to the USSR and to the world revolution. The international proletariat will not decline to defend the USSR, even if the USSR should find itself forced into a military alliance with some imperialists against others. But in this case, Even more than in any other, the international proletariat must safeguard its complete political independence from Soviet diplomacy and thereby also from the bureaucracy of the Third International, end quote. A stand on defense was taken in the light of this perspective. The slogan of defense acquires a concrete meaning precisely in the event of war. A strange time to drop it. That would mean a rejection of all our theoretical preparations for the war. That would mean starting all over again. From what fundamental basis, nobody knows. There has been much talk of, quote, independence on the Russian question. That is good. A revolutionist who is not independent is not worth his salt. But it is necessary to specify, independent of whom? What is needed by our party at every turn is class independence. Independence of the Stalinists, and above all, independence of the bourgeoisie. Our program assures such independence under all circumstances. It shall not be changed. The end. Thank you for listening. Hey everybody, this is a piece by Max Shachtman. It's from a debate. Let me actually read the introduction again to this section that it's from. The first two texts are speeches delivered by James Buchanan, which I just recorded, and it'll be up on the channel. And to Max Shachtman at the New York membership meeting of the U.S. Trotskyist movement, the Socialist Workers' Party, on the 15th of October, 1939. Ken and Shachtman, the two main leaders of the movement since it was founded in 1928, spoke for opposing sides in this debate, sparked by the invasion of the partition of Poland by Stalin and Hitler in September 1939. Contrary to most tellings of the story, the debate was not about how to label the USSR. Shachtman and most of his comrades still accepted the, quote, degenerated worker state formula, though with doubts, and they accepted, quote, defense of the USSR, end quote, against invasion by a big power. It was essentially about the balance between condemnation of Stalin's invasion and hypothetical defense of the USSR against big power invasion. So that's the context for this piece. So here we go. The question of today is Stalin's invasion of Poland. Max Shachtman, October 1939. In order to have a clear understanding of the present dispute, it is necessary to start with an account of how it originated and developed. It might have been possible to dispense with this aspect of the question if Comrade Cannon had not presented a completely distorted version of it. Our differences did not develop out of thin air, nor as a result of an arbitrary whim on the part of any comrade. It can therefore be understood only by a knowledge of the actual circumstances in which it arose. The question now in dispute originated in reality at our last convention. As will be seen later, it is important to bear this date in mind. As you know, prior to the convention and during its sessions, we had no specific Russian discussion or special resolution. Formally, the question was dealt with only to the extent that it was referred to in the program of transitional demands which the convention formally adopted. Apparently, nobody deemed it necessary to raise the Russian question in the manner in which it had been discussed in the past. However, the Russian question was raised in a new form, at least in one of its respects. During the discussion on the international report which I delivered, Comrade Johnson, which I believe refers to C.L.R. James, in his speech dwelt on the question of our attitude towards Stalin's policy and towards the Red Army in the event of an encroachment upon an invasion of Poland, the Baltic countries, and other lands adjacent to the Soviet Union. This question was assuming an urgent character because of the negotiations between Stalin and England and France. Stalin was demanding that he be given the right to, quote, guarantee, end quote, the Baltic countries and Poland from German attack. I emphasize the fact that this was at the time of the Soviet alliance with France and what appeared to be an impending alliance with Anglo-French imperialism, that is to say, with the, quote, democracies. Comrade Carter was the only delegate who took up the discussion on this point, and I referred to it in my summary. As I recall it, I said that it would be necessary to consider the question seriously, especially as it became increasingly pertinent because the masses in Russia's border states undoubtedly looked with the greatest suspicion, fear, and hostility upon Stalin's proposal to, quote, guarantee them from aggression, end quote. Nobody else took the floor on this point. I don't know whether Cannon was disinterested in the question or did not consider the question important at the time, but Cannon did not say a word about the question, either privately or on the convention floor. Nothing came of this matter in any concrete form at the convention or immediately afterward, because the issue was still somewhat vague. It was still in the realm of secret and obscure diplomatic discussion in the European capitals and chancelleries. In any case, it had not taken on such concrete form as to require from us an answer, or perhaps even to make it possible for us to give that answer. But at least one important thing to bear in mind is that the very fact that it was raised at that time is sufficient by itself to dispose of the slanderous falsehood now disseminated by Cannon and repeated in the internal bulletin by Goldman, that our resolution and standpoint implied a rejection of Stalin's policy only because he is linked with fascist imperialism, and an acceptance of the policy if he had been linked with the democratic bandits. The question, I repeat, was first raised in the period of Stalin's alliance with French imperialism, and if we did not present a concrete resolution, it was only because And if we did not present a concrete resolution then, it was only because it had not yet assumed concrete form. It was only after the Stalin-Hitler pact was signed and the invasion of Poland had passed from the realm of possibility and speculation into the realm of living reality that the question assumed the most urgent importance and actuality. It is not correct that everybody took the events in this stride. The fact is, all the leading comrades were greatly disturbed. At the August 22nd meeting of the political committee, I moved, quote, that the next meeting of the PC begin with a discussion of our estimate of the Stalin-Hitler pact as related to our evaluation of the Soviet state and the perspectives of the future, end quote. Nobody argued that there is nothing new in the situation. Nobody proposed a mere reaffirmation of our old line. My motion was carried unanimously as a matter of course, so to speak, so that the record is given in full and no wrong impressions created among you. I point out that Comrade Cannon was not present at this meeting. His supporters were not so intransigent on the question then as they are now. The next meeting of the PC took place after I had left on my brief tour on the pact. That was September 1st. The Second World War had to all intents and purposes broken out, and we were faced with enormous tasks and responsibilities. Comrade Gould, who was acting for a week or two in my place, made a series of motions for an immediate plenum, the aim of which was to put the party on a war footing, on the alert for speeding the preparations to qualify the party for its multiplied tasks. Some of his motions were perhaps not feasible, that is possible, but the general line of them was absolutely correct and in order. Everybody present was in favor of an immediate plenum. The difference revolved only around the date of a week earlier or a week later. But it is most interesting to note that everybody agreed to put the Russian question on the agenda and that Comrade Burnham was unanimously assigned to make the report on this question. Now, Burnham's position on the Russian question is no secret to the party, even less to the PC. It was as well known in the past as it is now. James Burnham's editorial in the New International, about which there has since been so much clamor, was already out. If the PC majority really and honestly thought there was nothing new in the situation, and if they really were ready to defend their old position without further ado, why in heaven's name was Burnham assigned to make the report? It is entirely unprecedented in our movement to act in this way. If, for example, I am known as an unavowed critic or opponent of the official party position on the trade union question, I would never be assigned by the committee to report on this question to a plenum or a membership meeting. The committee would assign a supporter of its position to report on it. In a discussion, I would be assigned to deliver a minority report. Why was a contrary procedure followed in the case of Burnham and the report on the Russian question? The talk about our having created a crisis or a panic is completely absurd. In actuality, it was these comrades who maintained that their political line is so clear, so unaltered, so uncompromising that they must have an organizational stranglehold on the NC and the PC. It was these comrades who showed themselves completely disoriented and incapable of giving the leadership they boast about. On precisely that question, which they now claim marks the dividing line between the hard Bolshevik and the vacillating petty bourgeois, they demonstratively acknowledged their bankruptcy by failing to put forward one of their number to report and assigning it instead to Burnham. Again, to keep the record accurate, Cannon was not present at the meeting. 2 days later, a special meeting was held to consider the question, this time with Cannon present. Although I was still on tour, I ventured to speak from hearsay because his arguments were subsequently repeated upon my return. Cannon charged that the comrades were creating a panic for nothing, that they were hysterical, that there was nothing new in the situation. As for the plenum, he was against its immediate convocation for the above reasons and because, Cannon said, it had to be prepared documentarily. Good. 2 days later, at the September 5th meeting of the PC, Burnham submitted his document on the character of the war and Russia's role in the war. Apart from this document, from my resolution and Johnson's statement, no other document was submitted for the plenum. Cannon submitted nothing, absolutely nothing, in the form of a resolution or thesis on the question, or, for that matter, on any other question on the agenda of the plenum, nor did anyone else. Was that because other comrades thought there really was nothing new in the situation? In my opinion, no. For on September 3rd, Cannon moved that Crux, Trotsky, be asked officially, quote, to express himself on the Russian question in the light of recent events, end quote. Furthermore, that Crux, Trotsky, be familiarized with the, quote, material submitted in the question, end quote, and that we, quote, request his opinion before a decision is taken by the plenum, end quote. Now, it seems to me that an obvious contradiction is present here. If there is nothing new in the situation, if all that is needed, as Cannon contended, is a reaffirmation of our previous position, then a decision of that kind could be taken without requesting Comrade Crux's opinion and without making it dependent upon his opinion. The opinion would be, as it was, valuable, enlightening, and important. It would be what you will, but yet it could not be of such a nature as to necessitate holding up a vote by us on the question. The fact is that everybody was disturbed by the events and felt that the old line, even if correct, was not adequate. At the very least, something had to be added to it, and that was the only serious meaning contained in Cannon's motions on Crux, Trotsky. It goes without saying that the request for Crux's opinions was adopted unanimously, but I at least voted for the motion precisely because there was, quote, something new, end quote, in the situation, and I was very anxious to read Crux's analysis of it, Trotsky's analysis of it. Yet I say that the motions were in conflict with Cannon's views because at the very next meeting on September 8th, Cannon and his supporters came forward against a discussion of the Russian question, against any discussion. There's nothing particularly new in the situation, said Cannon, in the circular he sent out to the NC members commenting on Burnham's resolution. A discussion at this time is a luxury we cannot afford, Cannon said, in just those words. When Cannon says now that a discussion of a position such as Burnham put forward would be fruitful and educational, it simply does not square with Cannon's statements a month ago that a discussion would be a luxury we cannot afford. On September 12th, at the first PC meeting to be held after my return from the speaking tour, there was a turnabout face. My motion on the plenum was carried without objection. I did not propose, as is stated, to call the plenum on the Russian question. The 4 points I proposed for an agenda, the war crisis, the work of the International, the Russian question, and the organization press drive, were adopted virtually without discussion. Why? Because I believe, among other things, I reported that every NC member I spoke with on the road was also, quote, panic-stricken. Clark and Solander in Detroit, comrades in Chicago, all were for an immediate plenum. In Minneapolis, I signed a joint telegram with all the local NC members pointing out their readiness to come to a plenum almost immediately. There's not the slightest doubt that every responsible leading comrade outside New York felt that a plenum was urgently required to discuss the questions I mentioned. In the middle of September, the events precipitated the problem directly and concretely without waiting for us to get together a plenum. Stalin invaded Poland in alliance with Hitler. What was the party to say? What was its mouthpiece, the appeal, to say? It is utter nonsense to argue that the membership of the party went blandly about its way, unmoved and uninterested in the events. They were intensely interested in the position the party would take on the invasion, and there is not the slightest doubt in the world that the readers of the party press were equally interested. It was, of course, impossible for me to write in the appeal on the basis of my personal opinion alone. I therefore called together all the available... Where am I? Sorry, I lost my spot. I therefore called together all the available members of the staff and of the political committee. By its very nature, the gathering could not be anything but informal. It could not adopt decisions on such a matter of policy, and I announced both before and at the end of the meeting that I considered it a consultative body. That is to say, only the political committee could decide the line of our articles. After as thorough a discussion of the question as we could have had under the circumstances, it was generally agreed that an emergency meeting of the PC would have to be held to decide the question, if possible, before the appeal went to press. That same evening, September 18th, a special meeting was held. We were of the opinion that whatever the party's basic estimate of the class nature of the Soviet state might be, a specific answer had to be given to the specific question. Comrade Burnham moved that the appeal take the line that through its invasion of Poland, the Red Army is participating integrally in the imperialist war. That is to say, we condemn the invasion. The point of view was rejected by the majority of the political committee. Comrade Goldman presented the following motion, quote, "Under the actual conditions prevailing in Poland, we approve of Stalin's invasion of Poland as a measure of preventing Hitler from getting control of all of Poland and as a measure of defending the Soviet Union against Hitler. Between Hitler and Stalin, we prefer Stalin." End quote. Comrade Goldman was the only one to vote for this motion, yet his position was entirely consistent in particular with the traditional position of the party and the interpretation we had always placed upon it. But with Goldman's motion defeated, Goldman voted for the motion of Cannon. And what was Cannon's answer to the problem raised by the Polish invasion? The answer that the political committee adopted, ? Here is Cannon's motion in full, quote, "The party press and the party press's handling of Russia's participation in the war of Poland shall do so from the point of view of the party's fundamental analysis of the character of the Soviet state. And the role of Stalinism is laid down in the fundamental resolutions of the party's Foundation Convention and the Foundation Congress of the Fourth International. The slogan of an independent Soviet Ukraine shall be defended as a policy wholly consistent with the fundamental line of defending the Soviet Union." End quote. Cannon. Now I contend that this was no answer at all, or rather it made possible a variety of answers. On the basis of this motion, a half-dozen members of the political committee could write a half-dozen different articles. We would repeat time and again that the Soviet Union is a worker state and that we are for its defense, but that did not answer the question uppermost in the minds of everybody. Do we support the invasion of Poland or do we oppose it? Cannon categorically refused to give a reply to this question. Cannon's point of view was that it is purely a military question and that we were in no position to express ourselves affirmatively or negatively on it. Our task, said Cannon, is merely to explain. In support of this view, Gordon, for example, placed the invasion of Poland in the same category as the invasion of Belgium in 1914 and argued that there, too, we merely, quote, explained, end quote, the invasion as a, quote, episode in the war as a whole, but did not say that we were for it or against it. Parenthesis, it might be remarked parenthetically that even in this comparison, Gordon was wrong because the internationalists did not hesitate, even in the case of Belgium, to condemn the invasion by Germany, even though the invasion by Poland by Stalin is not on the same footing. End parenthesis. At the same meeting, I moved that the committee, quote, endorsed the general line of the September 18th editorial in the appeal which I had written, or quote, endorsed the general line of the September 18th editorial, unquote, in the appeal which I had written. Cannon and his supporters rejected the motion, Cannon voting against it and the others abstaining. Why? For the simple reason that I condemned the invasion in the very mildest terms. I'd characterized the reports that Stalin was moving to the aid of Hitler as a, quote, sinister plan, end quote. Cochrane took objection to this phrase. Cochrane motivated his abstention on the basis of it. He considered it too strong. The very next day, the press carried reports of a statement made by Trotsky in Mexico condemning the invasion as shameful and criminal. At the meeting, we pointed out that the inadequate and evasive motion of Cannon would meet its first test 24 hours later at the mass meeting which Goldman was scheduled to address, and at which questions would undoubtedly be asked about the party's attitude towards the invasion. But the committee refused to take any steps to deal with this matter. The result was that when Goldman spoke the next day, September 19th, Goldman not only declared at a public meeting that there was a dispute in the party on the subject and that we were calling a plenum to settle it, but also that the political committee disagreed with Trotsky in condemning the invasion. And as you know, in the article which Cannon was assigned to write for the Appeal on the subject, he carefully refrained from characterizing or condemning the invasion and confined himself merely to rejecting the Stalinist contention that the result of the invasion would be the liberation of the Ukrainians and the White Russians. Finally, we came to the PC committee on the eve of the plenum. The document which we awaited from Comrade Crux had not arrived. We had the Burnham resolution on the subject, but the majority, which had insisted on the need of preparing material prior to the plenum, had no resolution whatsoever to offer. I could not subscribe entirely to the Burnham resolution, and I announced that I would offer one of my own on the invasion of Poland. When the question of reporters arose, Burnham announced that he would either write a different resolution or support one that would be introduced. This introduction occasioned no astonishment or criticism at that time. At the same meeting, confronted with the fact that the majority had no document at all to present to the plenum meeting, confronted with the fact that the majority had no document at all to present to the plenum on the Russian question, Cannon presented the following motion as his resolution. Quote, "We reaffirm the basic analysis of the nature of the Soviet state and the role of Stalinism, and the political conclusions drawn from this analysis is laid down in the previous decisions of our party convention and the program of the Fourth International." End quote. This was the sole contribution made by the majority. To sum up, therefore, the political committee confined the political committee's self to a simple reiteration of the traditional party position, not as a basis for giving concrete answers to concrete questions, but as a substitute for these answers. That is, the political committee failed and refused to give an answer to the specific questions posed by the events. To the extent that the political committee tried to give an answer, the answer was false and spread confusion or else left matters hanging in the air. Cannon's article in the Appeal is one example. Goldman's speech at the New York mass meeting is another example. If that is the meaning of revolutionary leadership on the issues of the day, I have nothing in common with it. Now, as to the actual contents of the dispute, one way of approaching the question is from the angle of the so-called unprincipled bloc that we have formed. The argument runs about as follows. Burnham says that the Soviet Union is not a worker state. Shachtman says he does not raise this question. Consequently, the minority is a bloc and an unprincipled bloc. I regard the charge as unprincipled bunk. While I have not and do not raise the question of revising the party's fundamental position on the nature of the Soviet state, I was and am ready to discuss the question. The fact is that I questioned such a discussion, and the minority supported me in this respect. We propose that the pages of the New International, our theoretical organ, be opened up for such a discussion. This was at first refused and granted only at the plenum. Why am I not in favor of centering the present discussion around that question here? Because I do not think it necessary. In fact, under the circumstances, I do not think it would be fruitful. The way in which the discussion has already been started indicates to me that it would only serve to obscure the real issue and dispute at hand. In what sense do I mean this? Burnham is now being condemned for having withdrawn his document, but this withdrawal actually occurred on the basis of the advice of Comrade Trotsky and on my advice. In a brief letter to the political committee which arrived before his main document, Comrade Crux, Trotsky, pointed out that insofar as the dispute was, quote, terminological, end quote, no practical political question could be altered by changing the formula, quote, worker state to the formula, quote, not worker state, or, quote, bureaucratic caste to, quote, class. Trotsky said, granted that it is not a worker state, granted that it is a class and not a caste, what change would then be introduced into our political conclusions? The opponents, as Crux pointed out, would have gained a, quote, empty victory, end quote, and would not have known what to do with it. I do not begin to deny the importance even of the, quote, terminological dispute, end quote, if only because we must strive for the strictest scientific accuracy in our characterizations, but under the circumstances, that is, of the need of answering the question raised by the Polish invasion. Such a dispute could very easily degenerate into a sterile and purely terminological discussion. That can already be seen as the manner in which the question has been presented. A worker state is defined as a social order based upon nationalized property. On that basis, many comrades conclude that the whole problem is exhausted. That being the definition of a worker state, the Soviet Union is a worker state. Thus, we do not advance an inch. Why would such a discussion be sterile at the moment? Because it would not and does not necessarily alter one's political conclusions. Trotsky pointed that out, and so do I. The political question is, will you defend the Soviet Union? Whereupon it must be asked, what do we defend? The only remaining conquest of the Russian Revolution is nationalized property. Now there is not a soul in our party who stands for the denationalization of property in the Soviet Union. Not Burnham, not Cannon, not Shachtman, not Johnson. C.L.R. James. The only question that can possibly be in dispute is, how do we defend nationalized property? Let us take the question from another angle. The fundamental position of the party, no matter how often reiterated, does not provide us automatically with an answer to the concrete questions. For example, Goldman, Cannon, Trotsky all proceed from the fundamental conception that the Soviet Union is a worker state. Yet Goldman approved the invasion. Cannon was indifferent to the invasion, considering it a purely military question which we were incapable of judging, whereas Trotsky denounced the invasion. It was for such reasons that Burnham was, therefore, prevailed upon to withdraw his thesis from the present discussion, to withhold it for another more suitable occasion and place, to confine the discussion of the questions that he and others had raised to the theoretical organ of the party. In this connection, I was challenged by Cannon. Why don't you propose to expel Burnham as a defeatist? I made a motion 2 or 3 years ago declaring defeatist views are incompatible with membership in the party, and Cannon supported me in that position. I do not propose such a motion now. Cannon says that I speak equally well on both sides of the question. By the same token, Cannon can speak well on one side of the question at one time and be silent on it at another. Why doesn't Cannon propose the expulsion of the defeatists? But it is argued, you make a block with Burnham against Cannon and Goldman, with whom you are in fundamental agreement. The argument is not valid. In 1925 to 26, the Sopranovist group of democratic centralists, bracket, within the Bolshevik Party, end bracket, declared in its platform that the bracket, Russian, end bracket, revolution was over. The Thermidor, bracket, counter-revolution, end bracket, had triumphed. Russia was no longer a worker state. Yet when the opposition bloc was formed in 1926 by the Moscow and Leningrad groups, the democratic centralists entered into the bloc. If the democratic centralists broke from the bloc later, it was on their initiative, quote, artificially, end quote, said Trotsky, and not on his initiative. Trotsky opposed the break, as he pointed out in 1929 in a letter to one of the supporters of the democratic centralist group. I don't know if that's the same letter that I'm thinking of, but there's a letter that was in the last volume of The Fate of the Russian Revolution, edited by Sean Metgalna, that was titled Letter to Borodine, Our Differences with the Democratic Centralists, which will be on this channel. Anyway, Trotsky opposed the break, as he pointed out in 1929 in a letter to one of the supporters of the democratic centralist group. If Trotsky joined with them in one bloc, it was because all supporters of the bloc jointly gave the right answers to the concrete questions before the party. In my opinion, that is what we have to do now. I could vote 100 times over, just as Goldman does, for the, quote, fundamental motion, end quote, of Cannon. So can Aberrant and Erber and others. But I cannot give the same answer to the problem that Goldman gave or that Cannon gave, and that makes it impossible for me and all others to join with them, just as it makes it mandatory for me and all others to join with these who give the same answer. But does not that deprive you of a fundamental position from which to derive your policies? Not at all. There are fundamental criteria for a revolutionary Marxist which are just as valid now as those criteria were a year ago or 25 years ago, even before the Russian Revolution. The first is the fundamental and decisive character of the war in question, and we say the decisive character of the present war is imperialist. And secondly, our policies in all questions must be derived from the fundamental conception of the interest of the world socialist revolution, to which all others are subordinate and secondary. Before I can return to this question, I find it necessary to deal again with the point. Is there anything new in the situation to cause us to change our policy? Yes, and in reality everybody acknowledges it, if not explicitly, then tacitly. Is it because of the pact with Hitler? If so, then you are a people's fronter. No, that is slander. I've already pointed out that the questions we now raise were first raised 3 months ago, at the time of the Soviet alliance and the democratic imperialists. No, it is not the pact itself that changes the situation. I have pointed out 100 times in articles and speeches that an isolated Soviet state not only may but often must conclude commercial, diplomatic, and even military agreements with imperialist powers, and that there is not a particle of difference in principle between an argument with a democratic country, a fascist country, or a feudal country. So it is not the pact itself that necessitates a change in our policy. It is the concreteness of the events it is doubtful that we could have foreseen them in their actuality, and the actuality, if only because of its concreteness, is different from our necessarily limited prognoses. As different as arithmetic is from algebra. As I understand it, that is how Lenin dealt with the reality of the democratic revolution in Russia. His prognosis about the, quote, democratic dictatorship, end quote, did not and could not conform with the concrete reality. Lenin had no hesitation in altering his political conclusions to suit that reality. I can give many other examples. It is argued that there is no need to be surprised at the events and no need to modify our policy because we foresaw them. Before 1914, Lenin foresaw the degeneration of the Second International, but it was only after August 4th, when the Second International ranged itself openly, and so to speak, dramatically on the side of imperialism, that he proposed a change in policy. That is to say, to withdraw from the Second International to which he had belonged and to call for a Third International. Another example. Trotsky saw and foresaw the degeneration of the Third International. In Germany, 1933, Stalinism betrayed the proletariat and the revolution no more than it had betrayed them in China 6 years earlier. Yet although we retained our fundamental views on the principles of revolutionary Marxism, we broke with the Comintern not on the occasion of the Chinese betrayal, but on the occasion of the German. It is argued against us now that we propose a change in policy only because the alliance is made with fascist imperialists, and that we did not propose such a change when the alliance was made with the democratic imperialists 4 years ago. One could just as legitimately argue that we consider it all right for the Stalinists to betray the Chinese coolies, but not to betray the superior white workers of Germany. Both arguments are equally wrong. What was involved in both cases was an accumulation precipitated in the form of a concrete event or a series of events. Similarly, in the case of the invasion of Poland and the Baltic countries, in the period of the pact with France, the question was essentially theoretical, and we could put forward only hypotheses. It is true Stalin was then also an agent of imperialism, but the war and the concrete events attending it had not yet broken out. Years ago, the Stalinist regime indicated that it might or would act in the way it has now really acted, just as before the War of 1914, the social democracy indicated that it might or would act the way it finally did when the war broke out. The challenge to present some fundamental change in the situation is in this case either superficial or irrelevant. As I understood our basic position, it always was to oppose separatist tendencies in the federated Soviet republics. Now I ask, what fundamental change occurred, what was the nature of this change, and when did it occur, to cause us to raise the slogan of an independent, united Soviet Ukraine, that is to say, a separatist slogan. But another example, when and did we decide in favor of a political revolution in Russia? Because of the imprisonment of the shooting of Zinoviev? The imprisonment or the shooting of Zinoviev? No. That is so much nonsense. We changed our policy on that question because an accumulation of things dictated that change. Take the question from still another angle. I do not have to be instructed on the admissibility of a worker state extending the revolution to other countries, even by military means and without regard for frontiers laid down in imperialist treaties, or that, for that matter, any other kind of frontiers. I have taught that to thousands of people. But I point out that throughout the early years of the Bolshevik movement, we hailed the advance of the Red Army into other countries. When the Red Army marched into Poland in 1920, then, regardless of whether or not it was tactically correct, we hailed its progress enthusiastically. We called upon them to weaken and destroy the Polish army and to facilitate the victory of the Red Army. We took the same position when the Red Army invaded Georgia, bracket, in 1921, end bracket. We said then that, quote, democratic, end quote, considerations about which international Menshevism held so much were entirely subordinate, parenthesis, if they were involved at all in the Georgian case, end parenthesis, to socialist considerations. We denounced the opponents and critics of the Red Army. We justified the entry of the Red Army into Georgia. Now, if there is nothing new in this situation, why does not the majority propose to hail the advance of the Red Army into Poland, into the Baltic countries, into Finland? Why don't we call upon the workers and peasants of these countries to welcome the Red Army, to facilitate its victory, to help destroy all the obstacles that stand in the way of this victory? Again, we endorsed Stalin's seizure of the Chinese Eastern Railway in 1929. We defended the action from all varieties of democratic and, quote, revolutionary, and, quote, critics. They pointed out that the railway was Chinese or partly Chinese, and that the Chinese were not consulted about the seizure. Why don't we, by the same token, endorse the seizure of Poland and other countries by Stalin today? What is new in this situation? The refusal even of the majority to take the same position today that we all took in 1920 and even in 1929 indicates that, at least in this respect, the burden of proof about what is new is the situation rests upon the majority. I cannot take seriously the argument of the majority that the only thing really new in the situation is that people in the party are succumbing to, quote, democratic pressure, end quote. That there is an enormous democratic pressure being exerted upon the labor movement and even our movement is undeniable. That it is necessary to guard against yielding to that pressure is equally true. But it is necessary not only to guard against that pressure, but to fight against it. How? But we must first recognize the whole policy of Stalin facilitates the work of democratic demagogues. As in the past, democratic demagogues exploit Stalinist crimes and the resentment against Stalinist crimes felt by the working class in order to bring the working class more completely under the sway of imperialist and anti-Bolshevik ideology. We can combat the efforts of the democratic imperialist agents only by a correct and unambiguous policy of our own and not by mere denunciation. We can combat them only by pointing out that Stalin's course has nothing in common with ours, only by condemning the Stalinist invasion as an act which is contrary not only to the interests of the international working class but to the interests of the Soviet Union itself. We cannot combat it. The workers will rightly turn their backs on us if we endorse Stalin's action, if we condone Stalin's action, or even if we appear to condone Stalin's action. Now, as to the slogan of unconditional defense, which we must now abandon, in my opinion, unless we mean to keep the formula and by means of sophistry to fill the formula with a new content. What does this slogan mean to us in the past? What did this slogan mean to us in the past? Goldman says now, quote, I repeat, it was taken for granted that the slogan of defending the Soviet Union applied only in a case of war of a capitalist nation against the Soviet Union, end quote. Let us grant that for a moment, and we shall see who it is that unwittingly yields to the pressure of democratic patriotism and to the pacifist distinction between wars of aggression and defense. What we really meant in the past, when we said we were for unconditional defense, was this. We are for defeatism in the enemy country and patriotism in the Red Army. In the Red Army, we are the best soldiers. We are for the victory of the Red Army and for the defeat of its enemy, and that regardless of who, quote, started the war, end quote. We never asked who struck the first blow or first crossed his frontiers. By Soviet patriotism, we also meant that we call upon the soldiers and population of the enemy to give active support to the Red Army, that we call for sabotage in the country and in the army of the Red Army's enemy. Isn't that what we always said and meant in the past by our slogan? Now, why didn't we and don't we say that in the case of Poland or tomorrow in the case of Finland? Isn't Poland a capitalist country? Isn't Poland an imperialist power? Isn't Poland an ally of the democratic imperialists opposed to Russia? In accordance with our old conceptions, we would have called upon the Polish masses to welcome the Red Army. Why didn't we? Was it because Russia was the military aggressor? But we have not even ever, and we should not now draw any basic distinction between defense and aggression. And Cannon was 1,000 times right in pointing out that Marxian platitude, as he so very often is. Further, why don't we take that line in the case of the Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia? They are capitalist countries. They are tools of one or another imperialist bloc. If they are engaged in any kind of struggle, regardless, I repeat, of who fired the first shot, or who first crossed frontiers, is obviously a question of war between the Soviet Union and a capitalist power. In that case, by unconditional defense, we must mean, as we always did in the past, that we are for the victory of the Red Army. Surely we never took the position in the past that we gave unconditional defense of the Soviet Union only when the troops of a capitalist power take the initiative in the struggle and cross into the territory of the Soviet Union. By virtue of our old position, we should fight for the victory of the Red Army and simultaneously for the defeat of the opposing armies. The majority is simply not consistent with itself. While holding to the old conception, it has adopted a document which says that we are opposed to the seizure of new territory by the Kremlin. According to Comrade Trotsky, the Stalinist invasion was shameful and criminal. That is to say, we condemn it. Now we would not condemn Russia for invading Germany, would we? And if Poland had first attacked militarily the Soviet Union, I do not believe we would condemn Stalin or the Red Army for repulsing this attack and pushing the Polish army back to Warsaw even further. Why would we? Would it be because in that case Poland was the, quote, aggressor, end quote, whereas in the actual case Russia was the, quote, aggressor? Again, Comrade Goldman said his error, which he now acknowledges, consisted in supporting the invasion under the impression that it was not done in agreement with Hitler. When he became convinced that it was done in agreement with Hitler, he opposed it. It seems to me that Comrade Goldman replaces here one error with another. If that is his motivation for opposing the invasion, then at the very least we overlooked an important problem in failing to oppose a similar step when Stalin sought to take it in agreement with Daladier and Chamberlain. That was precisely the point that was dealt with by Comrades James, Carter, and myself at the last convention. Certainly the reason we failed to act at that time could not have been based upon the fact that Stalin planned his action in alliance with the democratic imperialists. You give no answer to the concrete questions. Trotsky says, quote, we were and we remain against seizures of new territories by the Kremlin, end quote. Goldman says now, all right, but it's all over now in Poland. Consequently, the basis for the dispute has been removed. Unfortunately, this is not the case. If we are against such seizures, we are against them not only after they take place, but also before. If it is radically false to think that Poland was an incidental or accidental episode in the war, an episode of no characteristic importance. Yesterday it was Poland, and today the Baltic countries, tomorrow and the day after, Finland, Romania, Afghanistan, India, China, and other countries. The same problem will arise continually, and with it the necessity of giving an answer so far more concrete than we were systematically given by the majority of the PC. Do not think for a moment that you can dispose of such questions by the way Cannon tried to do today. I was shocked when I heard him say half-jokingly, quote, off the record, end quote, that the best thing that could happen to Finland would be to wipe it off the map altogether. That is a piece of first-class political cynicism. I'm not a Finnish patriot any more than I'm a Polish patriot, but as a revolutionary Marxist, I'm at the same time a consistent Democrat. I am ready to subordinate democratic considerations only to socialist and internationalist considerations. I have no hesitation at all in saying that I am concerned not only with the socialist revolution, but also with the national and democratic rights of Finland and the Baltic countries. I am prepared to subordinate even these rights to the interests of the socialist revolution if and where the two conflict. I am not ready to subordinate them to the interests of the Stalinist bureaucracy. Decisive in politics is not only the, quote, what, but also the, quote, who. I am damned particular as to who, quote, liberates countries like Danzig, bracket, then German-populated city-state in Poland seized by Germany in 1939, and bracket, or the Sudetenland, bracket, then German-populated areas of Czechoslovakia seized by Hitler in 1938, end bracket. Under Hitler, the right of self-determination, quote, triumphed, end quote, in appearance. In actuality, reaction triumphed. And when Stalin invades Poland, it is the Stalinist counter-revolution that has triumphed. Our policy, or rather, your policy, or rather your lack of policy, makes it impossible for us to talk intelligibly or effectively to the masses of these countries who are threatened by Stalinist seizures or invasion. I want to see the party and the international adopt a policy which enables us to advance the cause of international revolution in these countries. We say in our international program that the anti-Hitlerite patriotism of the masses in the bourgeois countries has something potentially progressive in it. I want to be able to say to the masses of Russia's border states, quote, your anti-Stalinist patriotism has something potentially progressive about it. Your fear of a Stalinist invasion, your hostility to a Stalinist invasion is entirely justified. You're not so ignorant that you do not know what Stalin's rule over you would mean. You must resist any attempt militarily or political to establish that rule. You must fight against the Red Army and not for the Red Army's victory, if it seeks to establish Stalin's domination over you. But I say to you, your present patriotism is only potentially progressive. You cannot and must not fight against Stalinism under the rule of your own bourgeoisie, be it Poland or Latvia be it in Poland or Latvia or Finland, because that bourgeoisie is imperialist or the agent of imperialism. You must resist being driven into slavery under Stalin, so you fight for power in your land, win over the army and establish an army of your own, the people's militia, and fight for your own socialist cause, end quote. It is true that by this line, I will not succeed in having a revolution in Poland or Finland overnight, but if I reach two workers with it, I will have brought them one step closer to the goal they must attain, and that is what should be the purpose of any political line. The majority says, we will not approve and we will not condemn. We will merely, quote, explain, end quote, the invasion. I say, resist. Fight the Stalinist army under your own independent class banner. Fight them because they have imposed upon them the execution of an imperialist policy. At this point, the majority objects. The term, quote, imperialist policy, end quote, cannot be applied to the Stalin regime. Comrade Goldman says that while the term may be used in a broad or journalistic sense, it is incorrect because it may be deduced from this term imperialism that the Soviet Union is a capitalist imperialist state. That may well be. I do not deny it, but it does not necessarily follow, for otherwise many of our characterizations would have to be rejected on the same grounds. In the first place, I am not the first one to have used this term in our movement. Only a couple of years ago, in a discussion with a Chinese comrade about the dangers of Stalinist intervention in China, the question was asked by the comrade, does that mean that Stalin can follow an imperialist policy in China? To which Trotsky replied, those who are capable of perpetrating the Moscow frame-ups are capable of anything. Could not a, quote, capitalist imperialist Soviet state, end quote, also be deduced from this entirely correct statement? We say that Stalin has adopted the political methods of fascism. Stalin's regime is closer to the political regime of fascism than to any other we have ever known. From this statement, often repeated by us, some people have deduced that fascism rules in Russia, but this has not altered our characterization of the Stalin regime. We say in one and the same breath that Hitler's regime is totalitarian, Mussolini's regime is totalitarian, Stalin's regime is totalitarian. I still believe that this is entirely accurate. The false deductions that some make from these statements do not mean that the statements are wrong. We say that there is a Bonapartist regime in Germany and in Russia. I recall that when Trotsky first presented the formula of Soviet Bonapartism, Trotsky was criticized by many comrades. They argued that his Bonapartism covers too many different things. He replied that while neither Marx, Engels, nor Lenin had ever applied the term Bonapartism to the worker state, that was not to be wondered at. They had never occasion to. They never had occasion to. Although Lenin did not hesitate to apply terms of a bourgeois regime with the necessary qualifications to the worker state, as for example, quote, Soviet state capitalism, end quote. Bonapartism, said Trotsky, is an exact scientific sociological characterization of the Soviet regime. Yet it may very easily be objected that it follows from this characterization that the Soviet Union is a bourgeois state. Again, Trotsky points out, and I think it is right, even though Comrade Weber characterizes it as stupid, that in one sense the Soviet Union is a bourgeois state, just as in another it is a worker state. Elsewhere, Trotsky says that the bureaucracy, which has the state as its private property, is a bourgeois bureaucracy. Shouldn't we reject these characterizations because of what some people may deduce from them as to the nature of the Soviet state? It is in accordance with this spirit that we say Stalin is pursuing an imperialist policy. In two senses. In the first place, Stalin is acting as a tool of imperialism, an agent of imperialism. To that characterization, nobody seems to take objection. Stalin crushed Poland jointly with Hitler. The spoils of their victories are being jointly divided throughout Eastern Europe. But also, in another sense, Stalin is pursuing a, quote, independent imperialist policy of his own. To my characterization, Comrade Weiss, among others, answers that there is no such thing and can be no such thing as imperialism except as a policy of decaying monopoly capitalism. The reply is correct only in one sense, namely that the policy of monopoly capitalism is the modern form of imperialism. But there was imperialist policy long before monopoly capitalism and long before capitalism itself. Quote, colonial policy and imperialism, end quote, said Lenin, quote, existed before this latest stage of capitalism and even before capitalism. Rome, founded on slavery, pursued a colonial policy and realized imperialism, end quote. It is entirely correct, in my opinion, to characterize the Stalinist policy as imperialist, provided, of course, that one points out its specific character, that is, wherein it differs from modern capitalist imperialism. For as I have insisted on several occasions, I do not identify Stalin with Hitler, Chamberlain, or Roosevelt. Stalin has showed himself capable of pursuing imperialist policy. That is the fact. The Kremlin bureaucracy is degenerated beyond all prediction. When we say it has interests all its own, we do not only mean that they are diametrically opposed to the interests of the proletariat, but that these interests are very specific. They also have a specific economic basis. Like every bureaucracy, the Stalinist is interested in increasing the national income not in order to raise the standard of living of the masses, but in order to increase its own power. The bureaucracy's own power, the bureaucracy's own wealth, the bureaucracy's own privileges. In the bureaucracy's struggle for self-preservation, not only from the living forces of the proletariat and peasantry in the Soviet Union, but also from the consequences of the chronic economic crisis in the country. It is now seeking new territories, new wealth, new privileges, new power, new sources of raw material, new trade facilities, new sources of labor power. A policy of expansion which under Lenin and Trotsky would mean extending the basis of the socialist revolution, means under the Stalinist bureaucracy, degenerated and reactionary to the core, a policy of imperialism. That is, it has an imperialist policy peculiar to the Soviet regime in its present stage of decay. Now that is as close to a characterization of it as I can come. How do you characterize this policy? What is your political or sociological definition of it? You do not give any. Now that it is as close to a characterization as I can come. Now that is as close to a characterization as I can come. How do you characterize this policy? What is your political or sociological definition of it? You do not give any. Bonapartism, too, is not 100% exact. The analogy upon which it is based is, like all great historical analogies, a limited analogy, but it is close enough. It is an approximation, and no improvement upon it has yet been made. Similarly with the term imperialist. Not a better term is found to describe the present Stalinist policy, and you have proposed neither a better one nor any at all. I shall persist in using the one which I have put forward. These are the considerations which, in our opinion, make it impossible for us to continue employing the slogan for the unconditional defense of the Soviet Union in the sense in which we construed it in the past. is that sense which dictated the attitude of the majority, most explicitly, consistently, and not accidentally expressed in the position taken by Comrade Goldman. It is, of course, entirely true that a fundamental line is required for a correct approach to all concrete political problems. The fundamental line must be, in general, the interests of the world socialist revolution. Insofar as the war itself is concerned, we must proceed from the fundamental and decisive character of the war, and judging it by that standard, it is necessary to characterize the war as imperialist in its decisive aspects. I say, quote, in its decisive aspects, end quote, because in all modern wars there are, so to speak, conflicting elements. Let me take a well-known example. In the last World War, Lenin contended in 1914 that if the struggle had been confined to a duel between Serbia and Austro-Hungary, on the part of Serbia, the progressive element of struggle for national unity would have been decisive. That is, revolutionists would have wished for the victory of Serbia, even of the Serbian bourgeoisie. But scarcely had that war started than it was extended throughout Europe. The progressive element represented by Serbia's national aspirations was lost in the midst of the struggle for imperialist mastery between the two big blocs. That is, the character of the war changed. In its decisive aspect, it was imperialist. Serbia was nothing more than Serbia was nothing more than part of one of the imperialist camps. Another example is furnished by the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Bismarck's struggle against Napoleon III for the establishment of a united German nation was historically progressive. But when Bismarck proceeded to take Alsace-Lorraine, the character of the war changed, so to speak, and was condemned by Marx and Engels. Now the present war may, and in all probability, will also change. Our resolution foresees that and provides for it. If the character of the war changes into a war of imperialist attack upon the Soviet Union, the position of the Revolutionary Party must change accordingly. Comrade Cannon notes that this is contained in our resolution, but instead of recognizing it for its real and simple significance, he devotes himself to scathing remarks about the phrase, quote, bourgeois counter-revolution is on the order of the day, end quote. For this obviously true statement, I am denounced as a pessimist. Why? Trotsky used exactly the same phrase more than 2 years ago. As far back as then, Trotsky said that if Franco wins in Spain, the bourgeois counter-revolution will be on the order of the day in the Soviet Union. I deeply resent the attitude which accepts without a word, a phrase, or formula, or concept uttered by Comrade Trotsky. And for purely factional reasons, condemns those who merely repeat the phrase as pessimists, if not worse. If the character of the war changes, I repeat, and if the bourgeois counter-revolution has not triumphed in Russia, we will defend the Soviet Union from imperialist attack. It may be asked, how can you defend a country that has pursued an imperialist policy? The class struggle is not as simple as it is implicitly represented by that question. Under certain circumstances, we have done that in the past. We will do it in the future. Even in the case of Spain, 1936-39, which none of us believed to be a worker state of any kind, we were for the, quote, defense, end quote, of Azana and his regime, i.e. the Republic, in our own way and by our own methods. That's a reference to Manuel Azaña. Wikipedia says Manuel Azaña Diaz lived from 1880 to 1840 and was a Spanish politician who served as Prime Minister of the Second Spanish Republic 1931 to 33 and 1936, organizer of the Popular Front in 1935, and the last President of the Republic 1936 to 39. Manuel Azaña was the most prominent leader of the Republican cause during the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939. A published author in the 1910s, Manuel Azaña stood out in the pro-Allies camp during the World War I. Manuel Azaña was sharply critical towards the generation of 98, the reimagination of the Spanish Middle Ages, imperial Spain in the 20th century yearnings for a Praetorian refurbishment of the country. Manuel Azaña followed instead the examples of the French Enlightenment and the Third French Republic, and took a political quest for democracy in the 1920s while defending the notion of homeland as the, quote, democratic equality of all citizens towards the law, end quote, that made him embrace republicanism. After the proclamation of the Second Spanish Republic in April 1931, Azaña became Minister of War of the Provisional Government and enacted military reform, looking to develop a modern armed forces with fewer army officers. He later became Prime Minister in October 1931. The Spanish Civil War broke out while he was President of Spain. With the defeat of the Republic in 1939, he fled to France, resigned from office, and died in exile only a year later at age 60. Back to the text. That was Manuel Azaña. Even in the case of Spain, 1936 to 39, which none of us believed to be a worker state of any kind, we were for the, quote, defense of Azaña and his regime, bracket, i.e. the Republic, end bracket, in our own way and by our own methods, even though that same regime was openly imperialist and still claimed imperialist domination over the colonies of Spain. With all the greater force, will the policy of defense apply in the case of an imperialist attack upon the Soviet Union? I've said that Stalin is following an imperialist policy in two senses, in that Stalin is a tool of imperialism rather than an agent of imperialism, and that his own policy is imperialist. I have, at the same time, denied the foolish charge that we consider the policy identical with the imperialism of Hitler or Chamberlain. No, there is imperialism and imperialism, just as there is Bonapartism and Bonapartism. As a matter of fact, I believe that the key to the imperialist policy of the Stalinist bureaucracy is to be found in the historical analogy with Bonapartism. The analogy between the Stalinist regime and the old Bonapartist regime has been used repeatedly by Comrade Trotsky and by our press in general. Given certain limitations and allowing for the necessary changes, the analogy is both correct and illuminating. Bonaparte came to power to safeguard the social rule of the bourgeoisie by expropriating the bourgeoisie politically. The bourgeoisie admitted, in Marx's words, that in order to preserve the bourgeoisie's social power unhurt, the bourgeoisie's political power must be broken. Yet though Bonaparte came to power to preserve the social rule of the bourgeoisie, Marx pointed out that the third Napoleon represented an economic class, the most numerous in France at that time, the allotment farmer. To be sure, the farmers then as now were a class only in a limited sense. Like Bonaparte, Stalin represents not what is revolutionary, but what is conservative in the farmer and all other groups upon which his regime rests. In order to perpetuate his domination, Bonaparte called out a policy which Marx characterized as the, quote, imperialism of the farmer class, end quote. That is, the policy or hope of opening up new markets at the point of the bayonet, so that with the plunder of a continent, the dictator would, quote, return to the farmer class with interest the taxes wrung from them, end quote. Sorry, I'm looking. Now, it may be argued that imperialism is a class policy. In the interest of what class, it may be asked, does Stalin carry out this so-called imperialist policy? Let us assume the legitimacy of this question for a moment. Here, too, we can find illumination in the analogy with the Bonapartist regime. Like the second Bonaparte, Stalin, quote, is forced to raise alongside the actual classes of society an artificial class to which the maintenance of his own regime must be a knife and fork question, end quote. I do not believe that the Stalinist bureaucracy represents a new class, in any case none comparable with the great historic classes of society like the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, but in the sense in which Marx used the term to describe the Bonapartist bureaucracy, so too the Stalinist is a, quote, artificial class, end quote. It seeks new resources of labor and of raw materials, markets, seaports, gold stores, and the like. It is compelled in life to recognize that it is compelled in life to recognize what it denies in theory, the impossibility of constructing a socialist society, even the caricature of socialism represented by the present regime in one country. As a bureaucracy increasingly separated from the masses because increasingly threatened by the masses, it is interested in a growing national income only for its own sake, only in order to enhance its privileges and power, economic, social, and political. But its own existence, its own rule, consists of the greatest brake on the development of the productive forces and consequently on the national income, hence its growing urge to expand and to resolve its crisis abroad. And where the earlier Bolsheviks sought to resolve the crisis abroad in a socialist internationalist sense by spreading the revolution, by raising the spirit of the class struggle abroad, the Stalinist regime seeks to resolve its domestic crisis by a policy which we cannot characterize as anything but imperialist. It is substantially on the basis of this analysis alone that we can consistently oppose what Trotsky calls, quote, new seizures of territories by the Kremlin, end quote. It is on the basis of such an analysis that we are able to tell the masses or their vanguard what to do before and after the Stalinist invasions. And what policy shall we advance for the Russian masses? There, too, I do not believe we advance very far by the simple reiteration of the formula of unconditional defense. I would say to the Russian worker or soldier, the Stalinist bureaucracy is hurting Russia. It is discrediting the revolution in the Soviet Union throughout the working class of the world, which it is driving into the arms of the imperialist bourgeoisie. It is using you as a tool of tools of imperialism. The task that you are performing now under Stalin's command is an ignominious and reactionary task. Unite with the Ukrainian workers and peasants in the territory you have been sent to conquer and jointly overturn the Stalin regime in order to establish a genuine Soviet power. And I would say this to them tomorrow in the case of an invasion of Finland or India. But I am now asked by Goldman and Cannon, you give no answer in your document to what should our policy towards the defense of property nationalized by Stalin after the invasion. What should be our policy towards the defense of property nationalized by Stalin after the invasion? Is it progressive or reactionary? I cannot characterize this question, considering who are its authors, as anything but imprudence. The majority refused to give an answer to any concrete question. We at least tried to give an answer to some of the concrete questions. However, insofar as the question has an independent merit of its own, it represents no difficulties for us. Naturally, nationalization of property is progressive as against private property, just as the freeing of the serfs by Alexander III was progressive as against the enslavement of the serfs. I would resist any attempt to reduce emancipated peasants to serfdom again. And it goes without saying that I would defend nationalized property, but I must continue to emphasize that the questions of today are not answered or successfully evaded by necessarily hypothetical questions about tomorrow. However important the latter undeniably are, they do not eliminate the urgency of today's problems, and the problem of a Hitler attack against the Ukraine was and is the question of tomorrow. The question of Stalin's invasion of Poland and of the Baltic countries is the question of today, and that is the one we must answer first, and that is the one the majority failed and still refuses to answer. I find very interesting and important the formulation in Comrade Trotsky's latest document, that we subordinate the overthrow of Stalin to the defense of nationalized property and planned economy, and we subordinate the defense of planned economy and nationalized property to the interests of the world revolution. I should like to ask a question about that formula. What is meant by it? So what is meant in the formula by, quote, subordinate, end quote, especially in the phrase dealing with the subordination of the defense of the Soviet Union, that is, of nationalized property to the interests of the world socialist revolution? Now, my understanding of our position in the past was that we vehemently deny any possible conflict between the two. The defense of Russia was always and unalterably in the interest of the world revolution, and especially against the Stalinists, we maintained that the world revolution was the best way to defend the Soviet Union. But I never understood our position in the past to mean that we subordinate the one to the other. If I understand English, the term implies either that there is a conflict between the two or the possibility of such a conflict. If there is a possibility of such a conflict, and I believe there is, it has already been shown in life that indicates again that we cannot continue maintaining the slogan of unconditional defense of the Soviet Union. By that slogan in the past, we meant nothing more than this, that we place no conditions to our defense of the Soviet Union. That is, we do not say we will defend the Soviet Union on the condition that the Stalin regime is first removed. If I understand the meaning of Comrade Trotsky's new formula, it is this: we defend the Soviet Union on the condition that it is to the interest of the world socialist revolution, that it does not conflict with those interests, and that where it does conflict with those interests, the latter remain primary and decisive, and the defense of the Soviet Union is secondary and subordinate. I should be very much interested in having the comrades of the majority give me concrete examples of conditions under which they would subordinate the defense of the Soviet Union to the interests of the world revolution. Give me one or two, and by an example, I do not mean the case of, let's say, a political revolution of the workers and peasants in Russia against the Stalin regime. How can that be interpreted as subordinating the defense of nationalized property to the interests of the world revolution? We have said in the past, at least, that the political revolution against the Stalin bureaucracy is not a blow against the Stalin bureaucracy's economic foundations, but that it is the best way, and in fact the only really sound and fundamental way in which to defend these economic foundations. The two concepts in that case are not in conflict. There cannot be, in that case, any question of subordinating the one to the other. The interests of both are identical. Until concrete examples are given by the majority, and until the questions I have raised are answered, and answered objectively and convincingly, I continue to contend that our slogan of unconditional defense of the Soviet Union has been proved by events, by reality, to be false and misleading, to be harmful, and therefore it must be abandoned by our party. We must adopt it in its place, a slogan which is clear, which is defendable, and which makes possible a correct policy in harmony with our revolutionary internationalist position. I want to turn now in my concluding remarks to other questions raised in the discussion of the Russian question and related to the Russian question. We are accused of many things. We create constant crises. We are panic-stricken at every turn of events, and so forth. These charges I have already taken up in my presentation, and upon another occasion, I'll take them up in even greater detail. Our charge against the majority, however, is of a different nature, and we describe it politically as bureaucratic conservatism. There have been numerous manifestations of this in the past, and especially in the recent past. We have found that whenever a proposal is made for implementing the party policy or for establishing a new line of policy or action, we are immediately confronted with the accusation that this creates a, quote, crisis. We had that at the last National Convention, where a perfectly normal and proper, and in my opinion still necessary, proposal to establish an organizational department with an organization secretary was met with a barrage of attack. Instead of a calm discussion on the proposal, the convention was thrown into turmoil in which we were accused of not understanding the ABC of Bolshevik organization. To the extent that the discussion on the proposal was taken out of this, quote, theoretical, end quote, realm, it was rejected on the grounds that no qualified comrade was available for the position in question. Our proposal that Comrade X be considered for the post was condemned, and we were condemned along with it because of our alleged lack of appreciation of the importance of trade union work in the field, and so forth. To shift that comrade to direct organization work for the party was allegedly light-minded and God knows what else. Less than a month after our proposal was rejected, the same comrade suddenly did become available, and this time the proposal was made not by us but by those who had originally opposed it, and it was hurriedly approved and adopted. It suddenly ceased to be a scatterbrained idea. It suddenly ceased to be the occasion for creating a crisis. When the war broke out, we confronted a similar inertia. In this case, too, our proposals for immediate action to prepare the party for its tasks were answered with the assurances that there is nothing new, that we had always foretold the war, that we should not be panicky because it broke out and want more of the same. Yet although this was the position of the majority of the political committee, I found during my tour that the reaction of the minority to the war (one line of text is missing) crisis, which was described as panic-mongering, was nevertheless the spontaneous reaction of all the non-resident National Committee members with whom I came in contact. Again, more recently on the question of the Russian invasion of Poland, the problem establishes the fact that the majority was not only prepared to give an answer to the new problems, but denied that such an answer was required. And when that was qualified by the PC as a concrete answer was finally written, it proved to be more of an evasion than an answer, and even this article, which appeared in the Appeal over the signature of Comrade Cannon, was and could be only a personal opinion of its author, for the simple reason that the motion of the political committee on the subject, as I quoted it to you before, was so general as to admit of a variety of purely individual interpretations. The political committee simply did not show a serious attitude towards the problem. At the plenum, the majority presented for a vote the document of Comrade Trotsky, (the USSR in War), which is on this channel, which had arrived only a few hours earlier. There could not have been an opportunity for any comrade to reflect on this document. Some of them had not even had a chance to read it. Moreover, it was physically impossible for anybody to have read it in full for the simple reason that one page of the manuscript was accidentally lost in transit. Nevertheless, read or unread, studied or unstudied, complete or incomplete, the document was presented for a vote and finally adopted by the majority on the grounds, as Comrade expressed it, of faith in the correctness of Comrade Trotsky's position. Faith is a very good thing, and a prompt support of Comrade Trotsky's position on various questions has justified itself on more than one occasion in the past, but faith is no substitute for arriving seriously at a thought-out position. This is all the more so the case with this document. Even a hasty reading of it must convince any serious person, as it convinced me, that it is one of the most audacious and breathtaking documents in Marxian literature. In it, Comrade Trotsky deals not only with these questions which we have long been familiar with and on which we have had a traditional and thoroughly discussed position, and also with a number of matters and viewpoints which I contend are new to our movement. The question of the inevitability of socialism is not, in my opinion, dealt with in this document as we have dealt with it in the past. In any case, it raises the question from a new angle. Similarly, with the question of the nature of our epoch, with which we have hitherto characterized as an epoch of war and revolution. Similarly, with the point raised in the document about the possibility of a new type of state which is neither bourgeois nor proletarian. These are questions which I do not want to deal with here and now, but which are, to my view, so obviously a matter for deep reflection and discussion as to exclude so light-minded a treatment as it is represented by a motion to adopt the document a few hours after it has been given to the members of a party plenum. When Trotsky raised the slogan of a united independent Soviet Ukraine a few months ago and proposed to submit the slogan of a united independent Soviet Ukraine, to an international discussion, not the slightest objection was raised. When we proposed to open up a discussion on the Polish invasion and problems related to it, the majority raised the most vehement objections. "We are not a debating club," they said. "The question was settled fundamentally at our last convention, and the convention before the 22 years ago. Up to the plenum, even our proposal for a theoretical discussion of the questions in the pages of the New International was rejected. Discussion had become, in Cannon's words, a luxury that the party could not afford. I point to the fact that even at the 10th Congress of the Russian Party, held under the threat of the guns of rebelling Kronstadt and of peasant uprisings throughout the country which menaced the very existence of the Soviet Republic, the same delegates who condemned the views of the workers' opposition as incompatible with party membership and which prohibited the formation of factions, nevertheless adopted at the same time a resolution which provided amply for the continuation of the discussion on a theoretical plane in special discussion bulletins of the party and at special meetings. Discussion was not a luxury that could not be afforded by the Russian party, even under these acutely dangerous circumstances. For our party, we were told, it was a luxury we couldn't afford. In addition, these comrades who insisted on discussion were sneeringly and demagogically dubbed, quote, independent thinkers, who believe that they are wiser than Trotsky. The political passivity of the party leadership has as its counterpart an organizational rigidity and a supersensitivity and brusqueness towards all critics, and regardless of the merit of the criticism. This is especially and notoriously the case in its attitude towards the youth. This fact has been observed and commented upon more than once, and I will not elaborate on it here, except to say that the truth about it cannot and will not be eliminated by repeating the commonplace formula that, quote, we must not flatter the youth, end quote. End quote. Just as a side note, when the split happened, the Workers' Party took the vast majority of the youth organizations of the Socialist Workers' Party. Yeah. At the last national convention, Cannon and his supporters demanded in their slate an organizational majority on the new national committee. On what political grounds? At the plenum, at least, the claim was presumably based upon the political differences over the Russian question. What was the political basis for this organizational majority at the convention? There simply wasn't any. At the preceding convention in Chicago, 2.5 years age, a more or less united leadership was established, yet Comrade Cannon could come to the convention in New York and declare that he would not assume responsibility for one single member of the political committee. We insisted at the convention, as you know, upon including in the new national committee a number of young comrades. The slate presented by Cannon's friends completely excluded the youth except for the one direct representative to which they are constitutionally entitled. The convention gave the party leadership what was tantamount to a mandate on this point by voting into the NC a number of youth comrades whom we proposed. After the convention, a residential political committee was established by the majority, a committee that was presumably satisfactory to this majority. That was only 3 months ago. At the last plenum, the committee was drastically reorganized, and so reorganized that we refused to take any responsibility for its recasting. The National Labor Secretary of the party was eliminated from the committee. All the youth comrades elected at the convention were dropped from it, including Comrade Gould and Comrade Erber, as well as Comrade George Brightman. That is, the committee was reorganized on a purely factional basis. I deny that this had an established political basis. I deny that it was reorganized on the basis of positions taken on the Russian question. I deny that it was reorganized in order that the fundamental position on the Russian question, about which the majority speaks, might prevail in the party leadership. If that was the only ground for the reorganization, why were not comrades like Byrne and Erber and others who voted for the original Cannon motion on the Russian question invited to the caucus meeting that was openly convened at the plenum for purpose of deciding on the reorganization? I do not agree with the steps taken for a single minute. I do not agree either with the conception of leadership growing among the majority and even openly advocated by many of them, at least in informal conversations. I do not agree that any one man must under all circumstances be guaranteed the leadership of the party or the control of that leadership. I do not agree that if you approve that concept, you will have a democratic regime in the party. I want a genuinely collective leadership, one that operates, discusses, and decides collectively, and a leader cult which we have had flagrantly expressed by a number of responsible members of the political committee is a bad substitute for a collective leadership. I freely admit that these questions were not brought up, at least not brought up fully, at the July convention. In the first place, the pro-convention meeting of the NC plenum decided against discussing such questions at the convention. The majority argued that, quote, the membership can't settle these questions, ... They must first be settled by the leadership, end quote. There is a kernel of truth in this, and this is another reason why I did not bring the matter before the convention in all its amplitude. It has not been my custom because I do not believe it is correct to precipitate every dispute and disagreement among the leadership into the ranks of the party. I'm not a professional, quote, rank and file, end quote, demagogue who rushes into a membership discussion on the slightest provocation or no provocation at all, and it was with the intention of exhausting the last and remotest possibility of resolving these problems among the leading comrades themselves that I hesitated to bring them before the convention. Yet the situation demanded that the convention be given an opportunity of exercising an influence and pressure on the leadership, if only on a limited scale. That is probably the reason why there was a certain confusion and bewilderment during one part of the July convention, and while I am willing to take my share of the responsibility for it, I cannot take it all, or even the majority, I cannot take it all, or even the major portion of it, because it does not belong on my shoulders. I believe also that it is imperative to change that alien spirit of arrogance and contempt for the membership which is manifested by responsible representatives of the party leadership in organizational and literary posts, which rightly irritates and angers the comrades, but which is considered by those responsible for it as a good characteristic of, quote, hard Bolsheviks, end quote. Repeated manifestations of this ugly spirit continue to go unrebuked, particularly by those whose main responsibility is to rebuke and eliminate them. These phenomena, and many others that could be referred to create a distinctly unhealthy and harmful situation in the party. The indispensable and preliminary condition for restoring a healthy state in the party is a frank, sober, calm, and objective discussion, not envenomed by personal and factional recriminations and insinuations. This alone can create that free atmosphere in the party which will permit an intelligent and fruitful discussion of the multiplicity of questions now raised again so acutely by the war and the new stage of degeneration of Stalinism. Only that way can we arrive at decisions, adopt policies which will be a firm and lucid guide to our party and through it to the working class. In that sense and in that spirit, as a contribution to that desirable end, we submit our resolution to the discussion of the party. Both speeches from Socialist Workers' Party Internal Bulletin, Volume 2, Number 3, 14th of November, 1939. Hey everybody, this is a piece from The Fate of the Russian Revolution. Lost Text of Critical Marxism, Volume 2, The Two Trotskyisms Confront Stalinism. This is a piece from Section 2 of the book, which I don't remember what it was called. Let me see real quick. Part 2 of the book is called The Great Schism. The section that I'm reading from is Defend Russia in Hitler-Stalin Poland. The first two pieces of this section were from a debate that took place, or if not a debate, like rival speeches between Max Shachtman and James P. Cannon. And this piece is a letter from Leon Trotsky to Comrade Shachtman, or Max Shachtman, and is labeled under the title. Obviously, it's a letter, so I don't believe it had a title. This is probably a title made by the editors, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is, maybe there was a title to it. It's titled, The Real Danger is Those Who Identify the USSR with Fascist States for the Benefit of the USA and UK. So here we go. Leon Trotsky, this is from 1939. Dear Comrade Shachtman, I received the transcript of your speech of October 15th, which you sent me, which was the speech that I read in the speech from this section. And I read it. Of course, with all the attention it deserves, I found a lot of excellent ideas and formulations which seemed to me in full accordance with our common position as it is expressed in the fundamental documents of the Fourth International, but what I could not find was an explanation for your attack upon your previous position, our previous position, as, quote, insufficient, inadequate, and outdated, end quote. You say that, quote, it is the correctness of the events which differ from our theoretical hypothesis and predictions that changes the situation, end quote. But unfortunately, you speak about the, quote, concreteness, end quote, of the events very abstractly, so that I cannot see in what respect they change the situation and what are the consequences of these changes for our politics. You mentioned some examples from the past, hence according to you, we, quote, saw and foresaw, end quote, the degeneration of the Third International, but only after the Hitler victory did we find it necessary to proclaim the Fourth International. This example is not formulated exactly. We foresaw not only the degeneration of the Third International, but also the possibility of the Third International's regeneration. Only the German experience of 1929 to 1933 convinced us that the Comintern was doomed and nothing could regenerate the Comintern. But then we changed our policy fundamentally. To the Third International, we opposed the Fourth International. But we did not draw the same conclusions concerning the Soviet state. Why? The Third International was a party, a selection of people on the basis of ideas and methods. This selection became so fundamentally opposed to Marxism that we were obliged to abandon all hope of regenerating it. But the Soviet state is not only an ideological selection, it is a complex of social institutions which continues to persist in spite of the fact that the ideas of the bureaucracy are now almost the opposite of the ideas of the October Revolution. Why we did not renounce the possibility of regenerating the Soviet state by political revolution. Do you believe now that we must change this attitude? If not, I am sure that you don't propose it. Where is the fundamental change produced by the, quote, concreteness, end quote, of events? In this connection, you quote the slogan of the independent Soviet Ukraine, which, as I see with satisfaction, you accept. But you add, quote, as I understand our basic position, it always was to oppose separatist tendencies in the Federated Soviet Republic, end quote. In respect to this, you see a fundamental, quote, change in policy, end quote. But one, the slogan of an independent Soviet Ukraine was proposed before the Hitler-Stalin Pact. Two, this slogan of an independent Soviet Ukraine is only an application on the field of the national question of our general slogan for the revolutionary overthrow of the bureaucracy. You could with the same right say, quote, as I understand our basic position, it was always to oppose any rebellious act against the Soviet government, end quote. Of course, but we changed this basic position several years ago. I don't really see what new change you propose in this connection now. You quote the march of the Red Army in 1920 into Poland and into Georgia, and you continue, quote, now, if there is nothing new in this situation, why does not the majority propose to hail the advance of the Red Army in Poland into the Baltic countries, into Finland, ... end quote. In this decisive part of your speech, you establish that something is, quote, new in the situation, end quote, between 1920 and 1939. Of course, this newness in the situation is the bankruptcy of the Third International, the degeneracy of the Soviet state, the development of the left opposition, and the creation of the Fourth International. The, quote, concreteness of events, end quote, occurred precisely between 1920 and 1939, and these events explain sufficiently why we have radically changed our position towards the politics of the Kremlin, including its military politics. It seems that you forget somewhat that in 1920 we supported not only the deeds of the Red Army, but also the deeds of the GPU. From the point of view of our appreciation of the state, there is no principal difference between the Red Army and the GPU. In these activities, they are not only closely connected, but intermeshed. We can say that in the following years, we hailed the Cheka in their fight against Russian counter-revolutionaries and imperialist spies, but in 1927, when the GPU began to arrest, to exile, and to shoot the genuine Bolsheviks, we changed our appreciation of this institution. This concrete change occurred at least 11 years before the Soviet-German Pact. That is why I am rather astonished when you speak sarcastically about, quote, the refusal even of the majority to take the same position today that we took in 1920, ... end quote. We began to change this position in 1923. We proceeded by stages more or less in accordance with the objective developments. The decisive point of this evolution was for us 1933 to 1934. If we fail to see just what the new fundamental changes are, which you propose in your policy, it doesn't signify that we go back to 1920. You insist especially on the necessity of abandoning the slogan for the unconditional defense of the USSR, whereupon you interpret this slogan in the past as our unconditional support of every diplomatic and military action of the Kremlin, i.e. of Stalin's policy. No, my dear Shachtman, this presentation doesn't correspond to the, quote, concreteness of events, end quote. Already in 1927, we proclaimed in the Central Committee, quote, for the socialist fatherland, yes. For the Stalinist course, no, end quote. Then you seem to forget that the so-called thesis on clemency, which signified that in the interest of the genuine defense of the USSR, the proletarian vanguard can be obliged to eliminate the Stalin government and replace it with its own. This was proclaimed in 1927. 5 years later, we explained to the workers that this change of government can be effected only by political revolution. Thus, we separated fundamentally our defense of the USSR as a worker state from the bureaucracy's defense of the USSR. Whereupon, you interpret our past policy as unconditional support of the diplomatic and military activities of Stalin. Permit me to say that this is a horrible deformation of our whole position, and not only since the creation of the Fourth International, but since the very beginning of the left opposition. Unconditional defense of the USSR signifies, namely, that our policy is not determined by the deeds, maneuvers, or crimes of the Kremlin bureaucracy, but only by our conception of the interests of the Soviet state and world revolution. At the end of your speech, you quote Trotsky's formula concerning the necessity of subordinating the defense of the nationalized property in the USSR to the interest of the world revolution, and you continue, quote, now my understanding of our position in the past was that we vehemently deny any possible conflict between the two. ... I never understood our position in the past to mean that we subordinate the one to the other. If I understand English, the term implies that either that there is a conflict between the two or the possibility of such a conflict, end quote. And from this you draw the impossibility of maintaining the slogan of unconditional defense of the Soviet Union. This argument is based upon at least two misunderstandings. How and why could the interest of maintaining the nationalized property be in, quote, conflict with the interest of the world revolution? Tacitly you infer that the Kremlin's, not our policy, can come into conflict with the interests of the world revolution. Of course, at every step, in every respect. However, our policy of defense is not conditioned by the Kremlin's policy. This is the first misunderstanding. But you ask, if there is not a conflict, why the necessity of subordination? Here's the second misunderstanding. We must subordinate the defense of the USSR to the world revolution insofar as we subordinate a part to a whole. In 1918, in the polemics with Bukharin, who insisted upon a revolutionary war against Germany, Lenin answered approximately, quote, if there should be a revolution in Germany now, then it would be our duty to go to war even at the risk of losing. Germany's revolution is more important than ours, and we should, if necessary, sacrifice the Soviet power in Russia for a while in order to help establish it in Germany, end quote. A strike in Chicago at this time could be unreasonable in and of itself, but it is a matter of helping a general strike on the national scale. The Chicago workers should subordinate their interests to the interests of the class and call a strike. If the USSR is involved in the war on the side of Germany, the German Revolution would certainly menace the immediate interests of the defense of the USSR. We would advise the German workers not to act. The Comintern would surely give them such advice, but not we. We will say, quote, we must subordinate the interests of the defense of the Soviet Union to the interests of the world revolution, end quote. Some of your arguments are, it seems to me, answered in Trotsky's last article, again and once more again, on the nature of the USSR, which was written before I received the transcript of your speech. Trotsky referring to himself in the third person. You have hundreds and hundreds of new members who have not passed through our common experience. I am fearful that your presentation can lead them into the error of believing that we were unconditionally for the support of the Kremlin, at least on the international field, that we didn't foresee such a possibility as the Hitler-Stalin collaboration, that we were taken unawares by the events, and that we must fundamentally change our position. That is not true, and independently from all the other questions which are discussed or only touched upon in your speech, leadership, conservatism, party regime, and so on, we must, in my opinion, again check our position on the Russian question with all the necessary carefulness in the interest of the American section as well as of the Fourth International as a whole. The real danger now is not the, quote, unconditional defense of that which is worthy of defense, but Sorry, I'm getting confused. Sorry, I'm spaced out. That is not true. And independently from all other questions which are discussed or only touched upon in your speech, leadership, conservatism, party regime, and so on, we must, in my opinion, again check our position on the Russian question with all the necessary carefulness in the interest of the American section as well as of the Fourth International as a whole. The real danger now is not the, quote, unconditional, end quote, defense of that which is worthy of defense, but direct or indirect help to the political current which tries to identify the USSR with the fascist states for the benefit of the democracies, or to the related current which tries to put all tendencies in the same pot in order to compromise Bolshevism or Marxism with Stalinism. We are the only party which really foresaw the events, not in their empirical concreteness, of course, but in their general tendency. Our strength consists in the fact that we do not need to change our orientation as the war begins, and I find it very false that some of our comrades, moved by the factional fight for a, quote, good regime, end quote, which they, so far as I know, have never defined, persist in shouting, quote, we were taken unawares, our orientation turned out to be false, we must improvise a new line, and so on, end quote. This seems to me to be completely incorrect and dangerous. With warmest comrade greetings, Lund, Leon Trotsky. CC to J.P. Cannon. P.S. The formulations in this letter are far from perfect, since it is not an elaborated article, but only a letter dictated by me in English and corrected by my collaborator during the dictation. This is from the Socialist Workers' Party Internal Bulletin, Volume 2, Number 4, December 1939. The end. Thanks for listening.